Everyone told me I was crazy for thinking I could build a production-ready SaaS app in a weekend. Well, not really. They were actually pretty supportive, but that wouldn't make a good hook now, would it? Well, in the next few hours, I'm going to show you the exact 8-agent system that you can use to build a $1 million SaaS idea without $1 million budget. And by the end of this video, you will have a serious competitive advantage when it comes to how you think about needing to hire or needing to invest as a solo founder trying to build something cool. And so this is actually going to be the first in a series of 4 videos. We're going to get the major base of the app done in this video today. Then in the next video, we will build out some really cool AI-driven features for that app. Video 3 will give it some final polish and detail that really makes it pop and turn into something that people would actually want to pay for. And then last but not least, the fan favorite, step number 4, DevOps, deployment, security hardening. Make sure we can actually deploy this thing and have it work when people want to use it. And all of this using Claude Code agents. This is going to be a 6-phase process using 8 agents that I built with the intention of mimicking an actual product organization. Because I'm a firm believer that these AI tools are allowing people that aren't highly technical to do highly technical things. And so the core most important piece of that, though, is using every tool at your disposal to attempt to do it right and do it properly. So I am drawing on my experience, number 1, working at a high growth SaaS company for many years, and number 2, actually having paid in a separate company developers hundreds of thousands of dollars to build an app. And so from those 2 experiences came a lot of knowledge and, more importantly, a lot of growth and understanding and knowing what mistakes to avoid. So while other people are out there shipping broken apps, we are going to attempt to build something that's actually pretty robust from day 1. Now, in the last video on my channel, we did a deep dive into each of these 8 agents and what they're actually meant to do. Everything from product managers to UX designers, front-end engineers, back-end engineers, DevOps, security analysts, the whole thing. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to string them together in order to actually build an app. And so the interesting part to me comes in phase 4, where we start looping specific agents together every time we want to build a new feature. But those first 3 phases are critical because it provides the foundation that phase 4 is going to operate on. My promise to you is this: by the end of this video, you will have a systematic approach to building that 95% of vibe coders or context engineers out there are not using. And so it will be a serious competitive advantage for you and allow you to build great things. So that being said, let's get into the video. All right, guys, so first I'm going to just walk you through what I have in this project so far so that we have an understanding of what I actually started with. Okay, so I have this root project called Forecast. And then inside of that, I have a few things that I am starting with as a baseline. So the first is my Claude agents. So all of the agents that we have, which we've touched on already, and I have an entire video where I go through all of these. So I'm not going to go into these in detail. We're going to be using them. We then have a backend repository, which has nothing in it yet except this file that says backend will go here. We have our front end repository. The only thing that is in this is that I initialized a Expo project. So nothing complicated there. I literally went into the terminal and said, did the command Expo create app. So that's this one right here. I did npx create Expo app at latest, and then I named it Forecast front end. That's all that's been done here. Haven't touched anything else in that. And then I have 2 other files. The first one is our high level app, which we're going to talk about in a second. And the second one is just some tech stack preferences, which we'll get to when we get to that part. So the first thing that you want to start with is really starting to actually flesh out what this idea is in your mind. Start thinking through what are the screens going to be like? How do I actually want someone to interact with this thing as an MVP? We don't want to just go in and say, hey, build me a cooking companion app and then just let it do whatever it's going to do. We want to be as specific as we have in our mind so far with what this thing is going to be. Okay, and so that is what I'm doing here. So user takes a photo of meals in restaurants, transforms them into a cook it at home recipe. So when the user takes a photo, they can also provide tasting notes. They can give a menu description for the dish. And then based on that photo, the app determines, number 1, what's actually in this thing. What are the different ingredients? So we're going to use some like multimodal image LLMs for that to say like, what is in this image? What is the type of dish that is actually being, or is like actually on the plate? Like what is in this photo? And then from there, it transforms it into a restaurant quality meal for home cooks. And so the general MVP in my mind so far, and we might build on this in the future, but at least what it is right now, user can obviously register, right? So they open up the app, they can register or they can sign in. If they are registering, then there's going to be an onboarding flow because we want to collect information, right? I want to know, does this person even know how to cook? Are they a beginner? Are they intermediate? They already consider themselves an expert? Like what is their general level? Because that's going to inform the recipe that gets made. What type of equipment do they actually have available in their house? What type of cuisine do they typically prefer? Just starting to gather information that later on we're probably going to pass to a language model to help direct the outputs, direct the answers. And then I'm thinking like at the bottom, right? So if I'm thinking now like, okay, how's the user going to actually interact with this? We're going to have this nav bar at the bottom, okay? And what is going to be in that nav bar? Well, number one, they need to be able to see like a history of stuff they've generated. Right? So if you were to think like if you were in Perplexity maybe and you wanted to go look at all the past searches that you had and maybe pop back into one and ask it more questions, kind of like that. So we want to have that past history of recipes. And now, okay, well, what happens if I'm in that, right? What happens if I go to that tab? Well, the user can see all the past recipes they've made and they can like tap into one of them, meaning they can like click into it on their phone, which brings them into this detailed view of that recipe. So when they're in that detailed view of the recipe, they can look at the recipe. I want them to be able to chat with the AI to enhance it, right? So maybe they were eating with someone that got this delicious thing, but they're actually like lactose intolerant, so they can't have some of that stuff. And so they want to enhance the recipe for themselves. So we're going to give them that capability to chat back and forth with like a chef AI. They can also like take that recipe that they're looking at and maybe clone it into like a new recipe. It's like, hey, I don't want to like interrupt what we have here. I want to clone this into a new one and start making variations on it. And then it should be able to scale the implementation of this thing based on that info we collected earlier. So like, is this person a noob? Are they super experienced? Maybe they don't have the type of equipment you would really need to do that. And so it needs to be able to adapt the recipe based on that. So that's our first tab. Then in this next tab that we have, we want them to be able to like start a new recipe, right? If I'm like in a restaurant and I'm seeing the thing, I'm like, oh my God, I need to do this. They should be able to kick off that either photo taking or uploading process because maybe they took the photos already. After they do that, they can then give what was the menu description, because on restaurant menus, they're typically saying, hey, this is this with this type of tasting note and this specific cool ingredients in there, right? They're kind of explaining what the thing is. So we want them to be able to kind of transcribe that because that's going to help give direction to the language model later on. After that, right? So they upload the photo, they give the description. Then I want them to be able to say like, well, what did this thing taste like? And so the way I'm thinking about this, the easiest implementation of it at least would just be like a slider where we could say like saltiness, tanginess, sweetness, right? All of that type of stuff. They should be able to like kind of specify so that again, we can pass that to the model that's going to build this recipe. And then after they've done all of that, they send it off for like an async processing in the background and they get notified when it's done. So pretty simple. Third tab at the bottom, I'm calling this like menu items. And to me, this is like a finalized, polished recipe, right? I've probably tested this before now and I really like it. And I want to kind of like think of it like committing it to memory, like a git commit. So I want to say like I have this snapshot of this thing in time that will be unchanged. Maybe I can fork off from it later, right? So I can still chat with this recipe if I want to, but in this phase, it's not really about experimentation. It's more about guidance on the implementation of it, right? So like I'm cooking this thing right now. I'm not chatting with you like we were in tab one about what this thing could be. It's like, no, I have this thing and hey, oh shit, I actually don't have lobster stock. What can I use instead, right? It's like that type of thing. It's gonna be a little bit different because we're obviously gonna prompt. The model will have different like system prompts for that down the road. And then a basic settings app, right? And lastly, the audience for this thing. This is gonna be like a cross section of people that they definitely consider themselves home cooks. They really like doing that. They like to maybe entertain people at times. They cook for themselves and they enjoy doing that. But they also like to go out to restaurants and eat, and they're trying to like marry those two worlds together. So that's like my high level idea for an MVP. This is obviously like for an MVP somewhat ambitious, I would say. Like, we're not just uploading a photo and saying, hey, what's in this thing, and building a simple pipeline. Like, there's going to be a lot of interactivity to this thing. So this is where our project is going to actually kick off. So we're going to come in here and we're going to first pop up our Claude Code. And now what I'm going to tell it to do is to actually invoke a specific agent, which is going to be our product manager agent. So we're going to say invoke the product manager agent and pass in the, I'm going to just copy the relative path of this file and pass in the highlevel.txt as its initial starting context. And we're going to let that thing go. So for this tutorial, anytime it's just like processing stuff like this in the background, I'm just going to pause the screen so that we're not just staring at each other. But if I get to a point where I'm needing to debug something or say literally anything to the system, I will unpause it. And even if it's us just bashing our head against a wall debugging something, we're going to do it together. So that being said, let's let this thing ride. Okay, so that was, I don't know how many seconds, not that long. And now it's saying, do I want to make the edit to the product requirements file? So it's basically just going to take that plan. It's going to create me a markdown file here, and then we'll see if this does anything else. I don't think it should. It should probably just end here, but let's go look at this product requirements file so we can see what we have. Now, I think there's two fundamental approaches that you can take to all this agent stuff. The first thing is going to be that you can create these like highly abstracted agents that kind of, they decide what this output needs to look like. But in certain stages, particularly in the planning stage, I want to see things in certain ways, right? Like I want to see this executive summary kind of PRD that I have. And what it's doing down here, by the way, it's just fixing these linting issues that we have where the markdown's not right. So it's not a big deal. Just say yes. That should be the last thing it does. So we can either be like very particular and concrete about what we're asking for, or we can be, it's still doing this. I'm just going to let this go through and execute all of these because it's just going to keep fixing linting issues. We can be very concrete or we can be very abstract. Certain stages, I'm allowing the system to be more abstract. Certain stages, I'm being very particular and concrete because this is how I want to see the stuff, okay? So we're going to go through and talk about all of this and all of these outputs. So if at any point you're like, hey, this section's boring for me, fast forward on through. So executive summary, elevator pitch. We want to, basically exactly what we said. We want to help food lovers recreate their favorite dining experiences. What's the problem? Food enthusiasts who enjoy dining at restaurants struggle to recreate beloved dishes at home due to lack of recipes. They don't know. They don't have the cooking techniques. They don't have ingredient knowledge. And current recipe apps, like they don't do this, right? They don't do this. Like if somebody else went to some restaurant that you happen to have gone to before and tried to recreate the thing, then you have it there. But there's nothing really that does this. And this is if you are one of these types of people, at least, it is a struggle. So our target audience, now this is important because this is who we're making the app for. Right? We're making the app for these people, so we need to understand who they are. When we get into like wanting to sell something to somebody, okay, a little bit of marketing theory here for a second. There's this concept of, goes by a lot of different names depending on the marketing experts that you subscribe to, escape and arrival frameworks, like as taught by Frank Kern, for example, where people are always trying to escape from some situation they're in and build into a new identity for themselves, right? And so we need to understand that that is how people make decisions, right? They are not looking for a small fix. They're not looking for a small improvement. They're looking for a meaningful change to their lives and who they are. And so it's important to think about because that's how you position your marketing. But we need to make sure that our app is taking into account, well, if that's the case, well, who is this person? Right? I need to understand that. I need to build features that help actually execute on that promise of that escape and arrival. So who is our audience? Guys, I'm going to just, by the way, tell this thing to stop doing what it's doing because I don't care about this markdown thing being formatted properly, and that's all it's doing. So I'm killing that right now. And we're just going to look at this thing. So primary persona, culinary enthusiasts. I would actually consider myself probably in this category, okay? So home cooks, intermediate level cooking skills. They regularly eat out at Restaurants, probably tech savvy, right? They have the disposable income, obviously, to be able to dine out and cook meals that have more like niche ingredients in them. And they have time, obviously, to cook complex recipes. Some of these recipes might take 5-6 hours start to finish if you're cooking things from scratch. Secondary persona, more the aspiring home chef. So maybe they're not as serious about it, but they've maybe thought about wanting to get better at cooking, and like this is a bridge for them to become someone that can entertain and wow and impress people around them. Again, escape and arrival. So they're novices. They definitely love sharing the food that they cook on social media. They're kind of like budget conscious, but like this would be something that maybe it's, a husband and a wife or a boyfriend and a girlfriend, and like they're gonna like invest in doing this thing together, maybe on weekends or whatever it might be. Now it's not in the MVP, which we'll look at, but I have this vision for this will eventually become there will be a social component to it where people that are really talented at using this system to build really good recipes can then share those things and they become someone that gets followed and all of that type of stuff. So I have that in the back of my head for like later feature development, which maybe we'll do a series on this channel on that. But that's that. What's the unique selling point for this app? Like what makes this app actually different from other apps out there? There aren't apps that do this, really, is the main thing. So that's a simple one. There's not really apps that do this. And even if there were, there's gonna be a lot of other cool stuff we build into this that I would imagine would be a competitive advantage over those anyway. So success metrics, again, this is like a product manager agent. And so we're not only thinking about the technical features, we're thinking also about what does success for this feature or this application actually look like in a commercial, more like commercialized sense. It's not just, hey, does this thing process at a proper time, right? Or that it's super fast at processing what it needs to process, but is it actually allowing users to do the things that we want them to do? And so what are some things we might analyze then? User engagement with the app. Are they actually using it to create recipes? And if so, how many recipes would we consider success? These are all things, by the way, that if you disagree with, you would come in and dial these in. So it might be 1 recipe, it might be 3, it might be 5, whatever it might be. Do they actually take it fully through to completion once they start? Do they stay in the app and actually using it? And then what is like an app score rating? Cool. So now we break down some actual user personas. Again, really important in product management or product in general, but also from the marketing perspective, right? If we were to build like a marketing plan, we would want to understand this type of stuff too, right? Like what are their pain points? There's a concept in marketing of efforts to solve. What have they tried to do to solve this problem for themselves previously? And what are they unhappy with those solutions specifically? That's a really powerful way to build a valuable product for people, overcoming the challenges and constraints of other tools they've used. So we have 2 of these here. We have Sarah, the culinary explorer, right? So she's a marketing manager. She makes a decent amount of money. She's kind of intermediate, bridging onto the advanced side of things. So she'll go to a restaurant. She'll have some like delicious like mussels and frites, right? She has like some really delicious thing, but she doesn't know how to recreate that at home. She can't make the broth that tastes like that. She doesn't really know exactly what she would need to do to make that thing. And her existing recipes that she can do, it's like, yeah, she could do those things well. Maybe she followed a cookbook, but she can't bridge this gap of like, I tasted this thing in a restaurant, let me go make it, and I know how to do that. And she really wants to be able to do that. Like given the choice, if she could replicate those things, she might eat at home more often. So what are her goals? Impress friends, save money, learn 2 new techniques, tech comfort. She's an iPhone user, high degree of comfort with tech in general, and maybe she uses some other food apps like New York Times Cooking or something like that. Secondary persona, Mike, the weekend chef. This one's probably a little bit more like me on the intermediate side, right? 28 is a software developer, makes 80K per year. Again, intermediate beginner. Maybe gets intimidated by like very long, extended 5 to 6 hour multi-step things. Doesn't really have a ton of equipment. Like he's got like a good knife that he bought one time, right? But he doesn't have like a food processor or any of these other things that he might need. Sometimes he makes a banger of a meal and he's like, oh my God, I'm amazing. I'm going to just drop out of software development and move to France and become a chef, and the next day he's like, he can't cook eggs the right way, right? So there's a little bit hit or miss. Very high level of comfort though with tech, and so a solution like this, he'd be super about it. So this is like, this first piece is understanding like, what are we about to do and who are we building it for? And then we get into our feature specifications. So what this means for each major feature that we have, what are we really building? Like kind of high level, like what needs to be true such that we say, yes, we did this feature to the extent that it needed to be done. So user authentication and onboarding, I mean, pretty straightforward, right? The user needs to log in, set up their cooking profile, and kind of start jamming on this thing. So what would then be like the acceptance criteria for that as an app? Well, when they open the app, they see the registration screen and the sign-in screen. When they register, they complete their email password creation, then they proceed into the onboarding. When they're in the onboarding, they set up all of these things. What are some edge cases? Do they have invalid email format, bad password? Edge case, are we gonna allow social media sign-in options? I'm gonna actually say specifically, I don't want to do this in the intro because for this tutorial, don't want to go mess around with the Supabase social media sign-in stuff. And so I'm going to say no social media or other sign-in options for MVP. Okay. Gives a priority score. Like this has to be done for anything else to be done. There's no other features that this depends on really. It's just build this thing. Then we get into some technical considerations and some like generalized UX considerations. I wouldn't worry too much about this because we have an entire agent that is going to be UX focused, but we're giving like some really high level stuff. So then we get into some of the actual like more technical features. So the first is going to be our photo capture. So what are the acceptance criteria of that? When they tap on the camera button, it opens the camera. When they take a photo, they can retake it or they can proceed to move forward. Once they've selected a photo, maybe from the gallery, right, they can actually capture the photo or they can upload the photo. That's what we're talking about here. Then again, it gets into like dependencies and things, so it needs to have permissions for that. And then some overall technical considerations. So sizing of the image, right? Does it need to compress the image? How is it going to handle that? Is there a maximum file size limit? What type of images are supported by the system? And then do we want to allow them to modify the image in any way? So maybe cropping it, maybe making it brighter, maybe giving multiple angles on the same dish so that it can analyze really everything and see everything that was in there. A few different options there, right? So it can take the photo and it can upload it. Then it needs to do that whole piece where we're inputting the menu description and the taste profile, which we talked about. And so obviously this has a dependency, right? Because it can't do that if the photo hasn't been updated yet. So this is where the dependency comes into play. And then again, technical considerations, some UX considerations, which both of these are like very rudimentary because we're going to beef the shit out of these things when we move forward. So then we get into the actual recipe generation, and this is where we'll start getting into probably more advanced things because we're going to be working with the language models, uploading images, having different system prompts for different types of things we need to do. But at the end of the day, what needs to happen? If the user gives a complete input and they submit for processing, well, first it needs to say that, hey, it's loading, come back later. Once the processing is complete, the user receives a push notification saying, hey, this recipe is done. Then they can go in, they can view it, they can see the ingredients, they can see the steps, they can see the timing. I would want to say in here, they also need to see the equipment. Okay, that's important to have. And then edge cases. What happens if the AI processing actually fails? Is there retry logic? Are we going to give like an estimated processing time based on the complexity of everything they've uploaded? Okay, and then obviously we have a lot of dependencies now at this point because they need to be able to have signed up, they need to have uploaded the photo, processed the photo, sent it to the back. The backend service needs to actually be in place for that to work. More technical constraints. So recipe history and management, right? So they need to be able to navigate it and see everything in chronological order. I think that makes sense. When they tap on the recipe, they need to see the detailed view. When they're in the detailed view and they want to be able to modify, they need to be able to do that. I don't see the AI chat in here. That's down at the bottom actually, so leave that for now. Okay, more technical considerations like local caching. What if they're in a place that doesn't actually have like internet access, for example? Okay, so if they're in the detail view of a recipe, they can chat with it, ask questions, give modifications, right? So we're really just piecing, or we're moving through this and seeing like, is there anything that is not what we want it to be specifically is the big thing. Like, is there anything very important that's missing? We need to be able to scale the difficulty, which makes sense. Okay, so if we're in this difficulty adjustment, for example, and the user selects beginner, they need to have that option where it changes to be a beginner level recipe versus an advanced level recipe. Maybe changing like serving sizes because it's not just for one person, it's for 5 people. If they don't have like a critical tool that they might need, explaining that to the user. I don't know, maybe there could be like some sort of e-com component at some point where you partner with different providers and you can actually, they can buy that equipment for future recipes. I don't know, something cool that could maybe be there in the future. Okay, we need to have an algorithm if we're going to be scaling things. It'd be very basic, obviously, but we need to be able to handle like scaling recipes. You don't want to necessarily like send something to the language model every time you just want to scale the recipe up. So that should probably just be handled by our backend. And then we have this finalized recipe menu that we talked about. So now as we move through this thing, it breaks down like a feature backlog for this thing. I would ignore the weeks and everything because obviously we're using AI to do this, so it's going to be a lot faster. But it's breaking this thing down into phases basically in terms of what it would build and in what order. And then it gets into like its understanding of general architecture requirements. So what does the backend need to consider? What does this kind of like AI or machine learning layer need to consider? We need to be able to tap into like the native iOS or Android camera functionality. Again, all things that we're going to need based on our app. And then we get into overarching app success metrics like downloads, engagement metrics, the quality of like our algorithms and making sure that like the users are having a good experience. They're not rating all the app recipes as like, hey, this sucked and wasn't anything like the restaurant. We want to make sure that it's doing what it needs to do properly. So again, we want to spend time in here, make sure we're dialing it in such that it makes sense for us. So after that, I just cleared out the context, so /clear, so that we're not dealing with all of those tokens in our next request. So what is the next stage of our process? So that first piece was really our phase 1, right? Where we have like our product manager level of understanding of what are we actually gonna go build specifically. Phase 2, we start to get into like the technical blueprint and the overarching UX UI design for this thing. So I'll give you an example here. I'm about to remodel my house. And when I first started talking to contractors, the smart ones said, I'm not gonna build this unless you actually have a plan made by an architect. And so this process is the exact same thing. We don't wanna get into coding the front end and back end already based on that plan we have, right? We wanna start getting very detailed. To use the analogy for a house, how many wooden beams are we gonna need? Where do they need to go? Why do they need to be there? How is the plumbing going to work around those beams? Is that going to be up to code? All that type of stuff. We're doing the same thing. And so there's 2 agents that we are going to use in this phase. We're going to have our system architect, which defines the tech stack that we're going to use. And it's going to start designing on a high level things that the other agents are going to need. What do the API contracts need to look like? What do the database models need to look like? We're going to start taking everything that we're going to build in the future and start building out a high-level architectural plan that all of the other agents will call upon when it comes time for them to do their work. After we're done with that piece, we're going to do the UX and UI agent, meaning based on all of these people that I'm trying to solve a problem for, how they would most likely want to interact with an app like this, how we want them to feel using the app, what that experience should look like, the different technical considerations, all that type of stuff. Then we're going to have it go build out a very comprehensive UX guide for them. So let's do that. So again, we are going to give like a specific command. We're going to say invoke the system architect agent and pass in the product requirements.markdown as its primary context. And again, I'm gonna pause this while it goes and I will unpause if it asks for anything. Hey guys, sorry, I actually already had to unpause because I need to actually pass in another file. So we're not only passing in our product requirements, but we're also gonna pass in our tech stack preferences. Okay, and now let's actually go look at this while this is kind of shimmying around in the background. Okay, so this is one of those pre-works that I said I did before the project. And so we're inside of our tech stack preference. Now, the reason I did this ahead of time is that I want to make sure we're being as efficient as possible. One thing that can happen when you are building a React Native app with Expo is that if you start pulling in a bunch of random libraries, you can get a lot of mind-numbingly terrible conflicts between the packages that you have to resolve. And so what I wanted to do was to make sure if I am building this as an Expo app with React Native, meaning cross-platform, that I'm using the built-in Expo app configurations for things wherever possible. Meaning, if I want to go use like the push notification system, Expo already has a solution for that built in. So I don't want to then go try to use like some other library to manage that thing. Same thing with like the camera and things like that. And so I took the time to go through and build out what I know I want my tech solutions to look like already. Now, we give it this command where we say, if it's not outlined, you can recommend something. Always prefer built-in Expo solutions, but you can't overwrite any of this unless you ask me first. Okay, you have to ask me first. Now, if you don't necessarily have a ton and tons and tons and tons of experience to be able to even say what these categories should be, you can use these ones because it's fairly robust as far as like the overall categories. But you can always go in and do like deep research and try to understand these topics and then use that to drive what your solutions will be. But let's talk about this real quick. So for the core front end, so this is broken down into front end and back end, right? We have the front end and we have the back end. So inside of the front end, what do we have? We have our core, like core most things. So like I said, React Native via Expo. So we're building a React Native app. I want to make sure we're using TypeScript. And then for actually building this thing and like getting it to the App Store, for example, Expo has a built-in solution called EAS. And so that's what we are going to be using. For the actual like data, like how are we going to manage the data on the front end in the app? We're going to use a state management library called ZooStand. And then we're going to use React Query and React Hook Form for some different, like, again, front end data management type stuff. Not super important that we talk about what all of these things are. I just want to walk through this so that you know that we are specifying a lot of this technology ahead of time. But again, you could offload this decision making to the agent if you wanted to. Okay, it's doing something down here because it's trying to update my thing. And I want to see what it is trying to update. Okay, so it created this system architecture file is what that is. So that's fine. We'll let that go and then we'll go back to what we were doing. So navigation, how is the navigation within the app screens going to work? Again, I'm defaulting to Expo recommendations wherever possible. So if we need to like deep link, for example, into a screen in the app, we're going to use Expo linking for deep linking. What are we going to use for like our UI and the styling and all of that type of stuff? Gave some considerations here for like what icon library do I want to use? Do I want to use a component library? All that type of stuff. What are we going to use for our networking requests? So if I want to send an HTTP request, for example, how are we going to manage our like data being stored in the front end? It's made a nice Git commit for us to say what it just did. So how are we going to handle authentication? I'm going to use Supabase with, if we use biometrics, Expo has a built-in biometrics interface called local authentication. I'm going to use Expo camera, like all of Expo's built-in camera and like image handling stuff. Same thing for the notifications. I'm going to use Expo. So we go through, we specify what we want our front-end tech to look like, and then we do the same thing on the back end. So I'm going to have a Python backend API. I'm going to need to do image processing. We'll go look at that in a second. I want to use OpenAI for all the core LLM work for now. Supabase for authentication. For any sort of like background job, so say this like thing explodes to 100,000 users and now I'm uploading images en masse and stuff like that. How am I going to handle that? So having like a background like queuing system so that the app doesn't freeze up when that's happening and it can just process them in the background. And then continuous integration and deployment. We'll get into some of this stuff when we get into like the actual like DevOps engineer and the front-end engineer and all of that. We'll talk about all of these tech and where they're being used. And then for deployment, I'm going to use Railway, which is a app hosting platform. And then I'm going to use Docker containers to manage like the development process. So let's go back now and look at what we had in here. So it is still just creating that technical architecture documentation. So I am going to let it go on that. And then again, we'll come back and look at things once this is finished. Okay, so this thing was about to go and start making all of these things, which I do not want it to do. I'll probably go back and update that agent definition to make sure it doesn't do this, because sometimes it decides to and sometimes it doesn't. And so I'm going to be very explicit that like this is just a documentation stage. I don't want it setting up anything. I don't want it setting up the FastAPI or anything like that. Okay, so we have this, and now we can go look at what that output is. So if we go into our architecture output, we can see we have this nicely formatted linked table of contents. Let's talk about what's in here. So high level architecture, this is a mermaid graph where it's basically specifying what's the relationship between everything. So we have this front end mobile app, okay? And in order to interface with the backend, it's going to go through this GraphQL querying system. Our authentication will take place with Supabase. All our database storing and all of that will be taking place in Supabase. Any background API jobs and like the processing of the API requests will go through a Redis queue. Okay, so we're just specifying like everything that is going to happen inside of this app. As we scroll down, we get into core services, right? So the mobile app, React Native and Expo, the API layer, we're going to be using FastAPI with a GraphQL to actually query the database. Again, all things that were specified in that tech stack. Authentication with Supabase, job processing with Redis. Image processing will be done through Cloudinary. AI processing with OpenAI. And then we obviously want monitoring, right? So if we know that errors are happening in our app, if we have thousands of users using the app, how are you going to know that shit's breaking and be able to look at those logs and everything? We're going to be using Sentry for that. So now we get into our component architecture. So we're going to have like our primary app component, right? Which kind of is connecting everything together, the app root. Then we'll have our core navigational system. And then we'll have our like more recipe-based components. Now, as we scroll down, it starts getting into detail about those tech choices that we made. So for example, we talked about using ZooStand for our front-end state management. And now it's starting to specify, okay, well, what are the particulars of that? You're going to have an auth store, which is handling our authentication within the app for the users. We'll have a recipe store, which is where all the active recipes and them being edited and all of that stuff live. Profile store for our user preferences, and then a chat store for our AI chat session management when we're chatting back and forth with our head chef. Okay, and then for our React query, right? How are we going to actually make requests to update things and change things? We're specifying what that's going to look like. And then we get into our API design. So what is the actual schema of our APIs, right? So what does the user type look like? They have an ID. They have an email, they have a profile, they have recipes, they have chat sessions, okay? What does a recipe look like? It has an ID, it has a title string, it has a description, it has images, it has ingredients, it has steps, it has a taste profile, a difficulty level, a status of that recipe. Is it finalized? When was it created? When was it last updated, right? So we're starting to specify like, of all of the things we're going to interact with, users, recipes, chats with the AI, what is all of the data that thing will have? Okay, and now you'll see on all of these, it has this little exclamation point saying like, this is for sure going to be there, basically. Like, don't allow it to not be there. I can't have a recipe that doesn't have an ID, right? That's not going to work for me. So we go through and we're just specifying all of those, right? For the chat session, and then even an enum for the recipe status. So saying it can be processing, it can be ready, it can be failed, right? For our recipe status. Okay. Now as we go down and we're making more GraphQL specifications. Now basically what we're saying here in these mutations is anytime we're going to actually change stuff in our backend, it has to be like this. Like, I'm not going to allow a backend operation to go through that doesn't conform to this specific format. And this helps make sure that we're not inadvertently messing up very important things. Okay, so we're going through, we're doing that, and then we get to our database schema. Okay, what are the core tables going to be in Supabase in this case? So we're going to have like a user profile table. It needs to have an ID. There needs to be an email associated with it. That person needs to have a cooking level, right? Beginner, intermediate, advanced. They need to have their equipment preferences, their taste preferences. Okay, we do the same thing for our recipes, for the images for our recipes, for the ingredients within our recipes, for the steps within our recipes. Same thing for our chats, right? We have sessions for our chats. Inside of those sessions, we have specific chat messages that are being sent back and forth. We have security policies around what modifications can actually be made to our database tables. Okay, we start specifying, hey, if you said you're going to use Railway, okay, well, this is how we need to configure a Railway TOML file in order to specify how to actually use Railway. Okay, you said you want to use Docker, well, this is what your Docker file at launch needs to look like so that you can actually run your Python backend, for example. If you get some huge influx of users, here's how you can scale it properly so that it doesn't start breaking, right? So all of these important things would be considered our core infrastructure, right? Our core architecture for the app. Now, after this is done, we're going to pop back into Claude. Clear out anything we have in there. And so now what we want to do is we want to take those user stories that we had from our product manager, and we want to start building out the UX and the UI for all of those, meaning how are people going to actually interact with this thing? Now, this stage is going to most likely be token intensive, meaning we're going to use a lot of the language model's processing power to make sure we get this part right, because we're going to be doing a lot of detailed work to understand each of these user workflows and what our app needs to look like in those workflows. So we are going to say, invoke the UX UI designer agent, passing in our product requirements as the primary context. Boom. And so this is going to go through and it is going to do a lot of work. If I run into anything again, I will pause. But this is probably going to take, this might take 10, 15 minutes to be honest. And again, it's going to use a lot of tokens for this specifically. So we will come back once this is done running. And now just to give you guys a sense actually of what this is doing, it's going to go through and it's going to create our design system, right? The colors, the typography, the spacing, all the things we specify that this agent should do in our last video. And then we're going to design the complete user journey flow for all 8 of those core features that we have. Right? All the ones that we went through earlier, we're going to go through and we're going to design out that flow for all of them. So the user authentication and onboarding, the photo capture, the menu description and the slider, the recipe generation, the processing, the different states, what it might look like if it fails, if it succeeds, the recipe history management, the AI chat management, all of that stuff is going to get designed out. And when I say get designed out, we are being very robust. So again, if we were to just go very quickly look at our UX UI agent, it is going to go through and for every single feature, it's going to be considering all of this stuff. It's going to be considering all of this stuff we went through in our last video. It's going to make the entire design system. And then for every single feature that it builds, it's going to analyze the user experience, what we're trying to accomplish. How should that be reflected in how we present information to the user strategically so that they're not overwhelmed? And then we're going to go through that entire core experience and actually document all of this stuff. So for example, if I'm in the recipe uploading feature where I'm taking a photo, what does that actual series of steps taken by the user in detail look like? All the different things they could click and why they could click it and what it does. How the interface responds to every single thing the user could be doing. How are we going to put validation in place, prevent errors? How are we going to progressively disclose more and more information to people as needed? What is the microcopy going to look like, right? The helper text, the little labels, the little instructions. Keep going, champ, with the little whatever that is, fireworks that fly out of the app, like all of that type of stuff. We want to make sure we are mapping that out. And then once we have that entire journey mapped out, we're going screen by screen through the app and giving comprehensive design specifications. Here's how it needs to be laid out. Here's what the purpose of it is. Here's what the typography and the layout, and here's things in that screen that would be interactive for the user. Here's all the primary actions they can take. Here's how the navigation's going to work. Like everything that you could possibly imagine gets thought about now. It doesn't get thought about by the front end engineer that's writing the code, right? In a traditional product organization that's like at least a little bit bigger, not like startup, you're going to have a product designer that does all of this stuff, and the front end engineer is implementing on those things, right? They're not defining how rounded a button should be. That's not what the front end engineer's doing a lot of the time. They're implementing all of the technical things that the product designer has specified. So that's what we're trying to replicate here. So again, we are letting it go. I will strategically pop in and out. If it's just saying, hey, I want to write this file, I'm not going to unpause the screen and say, hey, I'm letting it write a README to the file. But if there's anything that's like actually meaningful for you to see, I will unpause and show you. So if I don't unpause, just know that all I did was hit, yes, you can create a README. Yes, you can create a README. Yes, you can still create a README. Okay, just so you guys know, this is still just moving. I haven't touched anything. It is still running however many seconds later. So moving and grooving. We'll come back when this is finished running. All right, so this thing just finished running. Let me actually just pull that up real quick and show you guys. Like I said, this took about 20 minutes to run and 80,000 tokens. But you will see why in a second, because we got some very, very detailed outputs. And so here's the way that this thing, at least the way I have it built, if you're using my stuff, the way that it goes is we have this design documentation directory that gets created. And then inside of that, we get a few subdirectories. And then we get this README file, these user journey overviews, implementation guide, and so on. So we're going to go and we're going to look through this and chat about it. So first off, README, kind of just like a index of what we have going on. So the design philosophy talks about this a little bit, breaks down the target users on a high level, and then talks about the navigation of this directory. So we have this design system directory, which has 5 components to it. So the overall style guide, the color palettes, the typography, the component styling for like specific components that we're going to have, and then the spacing and layout grid. Okay, so that's all found inside of this. Then we have some accessibility guidelines. I won't go into that in too much detail. And then we have our feature section. So like I said, this thing goes feature by feature. So it goes through all of our AI chat, our photo capture, recipe generation, taste profile, user authentication, and it breaks down all of those things we were looking at. And so we're going to check some of these out, but I will get to that in 1 second because I just want to show you this implementation guide and the user journeys. So the user journeys are basically documenting like what does it look like for a user to be interacting with this thing in like a very tangible way, like what is the user doing? Okay, and so we have this broken down into stages. So stage 1 is the like initial discovery of the app and the entry into the app. And then what are our critical paths along that journey? So they go to the actual app store, they launch the app, they authenticate, they go through the onboarding workflow, they set up their profile, and then they have that first like aha moment, that first success moment. And this should take place within 3 minutes. So this is the first kind of critical path that we have. And then we get into this recipe creation journey. Okay, so how is the user initially feeling? And then what are those critical path user experiences, right? So they access the camera. They maybe enhance the photos, right? They're actually interacting with our application. And then we're talking about different edge cases. And then we get into actual detailed flows for every single feature that we have. So for example, in like the photo capture flow, here's everything that happens, like from down to the granular level of, hey, they request camera permission. Like, okay, well, dialog box pops up. They get a custom explanation of why we need this access. It can fall back to the photo library if the camera permissions get denied, right? So we're starting to detail everything that is going to go in here, even down to like advanced edge cases of those features. So for example, if we do allow multiple photos, how many photos? Okay, now like I said, we go through this for every single thing. So we did it for the camera selection. We go through this for the actual menu description component. We're doing it for the actual recipe generation. So again, an example, what happens when they immediately initiate the processing of this recipe? They get some state feedback. They get a time display. They tell you maybe where you are in the queue. I don't think I love that, but we could do something like that. And then we have this background processing with the notification that comes through. And then maybe we have these different visual indicators as it's, right, processing photo, understanding your flavor profile, is doing like little tiny things. Maybe you have like a little dish popping up and bouncing around on the screen. There's a lot of cool stuff we could do there. Okay, and then we get into, all right, well, if I'm a developer, how do I implement this, right? So I have these things that I know I need to do. How do I implement this specifically? And so when we come in here, we're specifying what the related files are for this. So our actual design system, style guide, all of the user journeys, and our accessibility guidelines. These are all going to be related to this task that you're doing, so it knows to dive into those for context. And then we have these different dependencies that need to be here. And so again, if we're instructing a developer on what to do, there are certain things, right? First, you need to implement our foundations. Then you need to build this critical user path. Then we need to have that core value prop built out, which is the ability to even take photos in the first place, right? So on and so on through our app. And then we break down our design system, right? So we're gonna have a token-based design system. Well, here is what that looks like, all detailed very nicely so that, again, a front-end developer can just take this thing and roll with it. And here's specifically what it should look like, right? We should have the tokens being exported from its own file. We even get down to the level of detail of, hey, we're gonna build out these components. This is what this should look like. The primary button should probably look something like this, and this is how it should be styled. Again, this is a UX UI exercise. And we're doing that, again, for every single feature and all of the components within those features. So we've looked at kind of what the accessibility considerations look like, overarching the design system that we have here, how it should be implemented, the user stories that we are implementing through the features, and then, like I said, we have our actual features. So let's go dive into one of these and look at what that structure looks like. So if we look inside of this AI chat file, so we have a similar format to earlier where first it's going to specify what the files that are kind of related to this feature are so that it knows to go, for example, look at the design system style guide, look at the user journeys, look at the implementation guide, look at all of those things before we go to actually build out what is ever in here. So the way this is structured is we start with the feature overview, right? So this is the AI chat feature. Okay, so what's the primary user story associated with this? And then what does that UX analysis for this actually look like? So we go through, we detail all this out. We start talking about like the information architecture and hierarchy. What type of things, for example, are we going to be showing to the user? What does the actual chat interface feel like? Are there things, for example, like quick actions, visuals for the person, making sure that AI has the full context of the specific recipe that it's working on, things like that. So then we get into the screen-by-screen design specifications. So what does that mean? So in the context of this app, if we're talking about like an AI chat interface, there's like a few different screens that might be there. You have like your main chat interface, but then you have like these little quick actions, and they could maybe have their own like screen interactions and all that. So we want to make sure we're going through the feature screen by screen and making sure that everything is clear ahead of time. And of course, as we do any of this, we want to make sure that there's not features that it's planning to build that we do not want in here. So for example, something like the voice activated entry, I mean, that could be complicated. So you might not want that to actually be in there. So again, for this AI chat, our first screen is the actual like chat interface layout. And we're breaking down like, well, what does that layout actually look like? What is the actual stuff on like the default view, right? I pop open this recipe and I ask for the chat and it opens up. It's the default state. What does it say? Does it greet me? Does it wait for the user to send a message? Does it make a little joke? Like, what's actually going on there? How are we going to actually style or design the message threads? What do the AI messages look like? How is that different from what the user messages look like? How does that all change when it's an active conversation? Right? And then we're repeating this process for everything. So we have, like I said earlier, inputs and quick actions. So what does that look like on this screen? What does it look like if someone's in a voice mode, but they're looking at the screen? How is that responding? What's the actual personality of the AI, right? Is it like Gordon Ramsay yelling at people, telling them they're dumb? Or is it encouraging and patient and knowledgeable and things like that? We give some examples of they need to modify the recipe, they need help with the technique, they're troubleshooting something, Now, when we get into some of these advanced features, this might be a lot to build, right? Current step tracking, now building a system so that the AI actually knows what step of the process it's on, and having a system to mark that certain steps are done and things like that. I do not want to build all of this right now. So if I had a MCP server like Linear or some project management tool, I would probably add this stuff to the feature backlog. So here's an example of what I mean by something like that. So I might have it go through the features directory, go through the feature directory and parse out any advanced features and add them to the product backlog via the Linear MCP, okay? Because I do not want to go dive into doing all this type of stuff in an MVP. Wouldn't be an MVP, it would just be a fully fledged software product. Okay, so now it's asking to like add it, and so I'm just gonna let this go through and do its thing and hit go, 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 go. Now, while that's going, I just want to show you guys, this is kind of what this is looking like. So all of these features, I have it going through everything in our featured specification docs and analyzing anything that is an advanced feature and pulling it out and putting it in the backlog. So now we have this backlog. When this thing's launched and we want to start building things and we're getting feedback from users, we can identify which of these, if any, actually makes sense, and then we have clear documentation on those things. So we're just going to repeat this process. We're going to go through, we're going to make sure that we're not signing ourselves up to build something that we did not actually want. And then from there, we will proceed to the next step. So I'm going to do this in the background, and if there's anything that I actually do decide to change or something that I just want to point out, I will unpause and come back and chat with you guys about it. All right, guys. And so as we're going through this, I'm in the next one. I went into photo capture, and there's already things that are a little too ambitious, I think, for this as an MVP. For example, like real-time photo analysis, where I need to now real-time detect things in the frame and do things like that. This is, I think, a little bit too ambitious for this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight all of that, and I'm going to say move these lines to the backlog using the Linear MCP. So I don't want these being developed right now, but I don't want to lose sight of them because I think they're good ideas, right? So I'm going to just move them into our backlog. Okay, so that was moved to the backlog. And now as we continue through here, multiple photo mode, I think this is good. We've talked about this. I think it's good to be able to upload multiple photos, delete photos, that's fine. Now, same thing with these edge cases. I think these are too advanced, right? Because they're all relying on this real-time detection thing. So I'm going to say the same thing here. Move the edge cases to backlog via Linear. Okay, so I want those moved to the backlog. For the photo review and selection, this seems mostly fine to me. Multiple photo review seems fine. The enhancement mode, if they want to actually enhance the photo, it's fine. This one needs to be moved to the backlog, right? Anything, I think in order to be a little more effective with this actually, I'm gonna ask it, go through and move anything to the backlog that clearly relies on the real-time photo ingredients quality identification system. Okay, so I don't want to have to go through and do that every single time, and they all seem to be related to the same thing that's giving us that problem. Outside of that, getting like start getting into performance specifications and implementation guidelines and things like that. So that was the photo capture. Then we do the same thing for a recipe generation system. One thing to watch out for with this, some of these related files aren't actually in our directory here, so we would probably, again, want to make sure our prompting is going to be covering off on these types of situations. I'm actually just going to copy the absolute path for that. Copy the implementation guide. Then everything else I'm pretty sure was in this style guide.markdown. User journey, put that in there too. Just to say, hey, these are all the relative or relevant. Oh, I already have that one. These are all the relevant files. Okay. So again, for this one, I'm going to skip down to where we have our screens and make sure that there's nothing really off here. And if there is, I will come back on and talk about it. So one little tiny thing that I know I'm going to want to add to the backlog, we have these things like adding personal touches. I really like the type of like user experience where they're kind of like rotating like funnier kind of things that have a little bit more personality to them. So for example, instead of saying like adding personal touches, maybe saying something like refining butter ratio, right? Things like adding an extra pinch of salt, things that are like a little bit more, I don't know, personable. Those are some things that I would want to add in there. So again, I'm going to open up the terminal and I'm going to say, I'm going to copy an example of one of these and I'm going to say, add to our feature backlog via linear a story to make more humorous, personality driven system messages when things are processing. All right, kind of just like they're doing here, simmering, wandering. Like I like that. So it's my app, I'll do what I want. I do like the cooking tip carousel. It's obviously going to be important that these are relevant to what they're cooking. You don't want to say, let your meat rest, and it's like a vegetarian meal, but we can get into those details later. Background processing. Anyway, I'll keep looking through these and come back again at relevant points. And guys, just before I transition to the next stage, because I did this and I think it's relevant as like what's a practical use of some of these features you hear about. So I found that every time I was using linear MCP to move a task to the backlog, it was leaving that file as it was. So it was actually leaving references to the old thing in there. And I don't want that because this is going to get passed to a backend engineer and a front-end engineer agent, and I don't want them building that feature. So I added this memory into Claude Code, which says anytime you use the linear MCP server to move a task to the backlog, if you're inside of a markdown file that is dealing with feature documentation, you need to remove it from the markdown file. So I just wanted to give you that little brief aside as I was moving through, because it's like a very concrete example of when you would use like a memory inside of Claude. All right, so we're almost ready to move to the next stage. I went through all of these and made sure I didn't really delete that much more other than what we did on screen, but it was the same process. Like, hey, I don't want to build this right now. That's going to be too complicated. Now, the last thing that I want to do is I want this to go recursively through this entire directory. So I'll say go through every directory inside of features and see if we added in any new technical details or dependencies that now need to be accounted for by the system architect agent. Meaning, did we just add something in? So did the language model, when it went out there, come up with some idea for something that is now actually another piece of technology that we need to have and that we need to consider? And I'm actually going to just do this in planning mode so that it will reply back to me and we can have a conversation about it before I go to actually update that system documentation. So I'm going to let that run and then we'll come back and talk about what we got. All right, guys, so it went through everything and it said, yes, in fact, we do need to update a few things, right? We have some of these like voice processing features now, which I decided to include in this scope, even though maybe should not have, but I'm going to do it anyway. And so now we need to consider processing voice notes from the user, making sure we're really dialed in on the chat system now that we know what it actually entails. Same thing with the queue management system, going to probably be a little bit more involved. Multimodal integration with OpenAI so that we can upload the images, multiple images, have it process all of those things. And so we're going to let it make those updates that it wants to make, and then we will come back and move to the next stage of the process. All right, guys, so we just updated our architecture documentation, and now we're going to move on to getting ready to actually start building this thing. And so we have this little pre-step of getting our initial DevOps environment set up. And what I mean by that is I know I want to deploy this thing on Docker, right? So I'm going to use Railway. I'm going to have a Docker image and I'm going to deploy this thing. And so I want to start developing locally with that in mind, meaning I want to set up a Docker Compose file and be ready to actually start running this thing locally on my computer so that we're ready when we need to deploy it and we know all the dependencies are there and it makes sense. And it's basically going to work on my computer the same way that it does up in the cloud. And so a lot of beginners especially don't containerize their apps, meaning they don't really do this process. And it's really going to make things a lot easier. It's going to make sure you have a consistent development environment, again, so that the things you're doing on your local computer are the same things that happen up in the cloud, and you know that there's not any weird thing that you weren't expecting that's going to happen. And so what we're going to do is we're going to provide our architecture document that we have, and we're going to ask it to build out a Docker file for us to run our backend on. So that being said, let us look at that. So inside of our agent library that we have here, we have this DevOps engineer file. And so what we're going to do is we are going to, again, call that. So we're going to say invoke the DevOps engineer agent to create a backend Docker file. And I'm going to specify the repo just to be clear, forecast-backend, based on our system architecture, which is detailed in. And then where did we have that? Right here. We're going to tell it where it's detailed. Okay. And then we are going to say go. And again, we'll come back once this hits some sort of point that's meaningful to show you. All right, guys, so this entire thing ran, and this is, I didn't do anything. Again, I didn't do anything. And this is what we got out. So we have a Docker file. So if we were to go look in our backend directory, we now have this Docker file in here, which is basically specifying how to actually do the build that we need. So I'm not going to look at that in detail, but we have that Docker file there. It created this .environment.example, which is going to be, hey, based on what we're building, these are all of the different things you need to go and configure with instructions on exactly where to go find these things. We got our Docker compose file. We've got our Redis configuration. So again, it basically went through and built out all of the fundamental things that we're going to need in order to start developing locally. So from here, the only thing I'm going to be doing off screen is I'm going to go through, I'm going to copy over this environment example variable and fill in all my actual environment variables. I'm not going to show you that obviously because then you'll have all my API keys. So we're going to go do that, and then we're going to come back and we're going to try to actually build this thing. I'm going to do it fresh for the first time. So this is probably where we'll start hitting bugs for the first time. So get out your fly swatters. All right, so we are going to pop this bad boy open here, and we're going to run the command it gave us, docker compose up build. I need to have Docker running on my computer. That would be nice. Okay, so I opened up Docker because I have Docker desktop, and now it is trying to go do all its stuff. So let's see what we get. Okay, so we got an error pretty quickly. Let's be honest, that was pretty quick fail. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this all the way down. We're going to pop open VS Code, and we are just going to paste in our errors, and we'll see what this does. Okay, so it's saying it had the wrong package in there, so that's cool. That seems to have at least solved that first problem, and then I'll pause, and then we'll see if we get something else. All right, so we just got an error. So cannot install this because there's a conflicting packages. So we're going to pop back to VS Code. We're going to paste that in, and we're going to let it go. Okay, and so it says that the server is up and running, and we're getting the health endpoint that we created, which I'll show you that in the project. So we have this health check endpoint, which basically means like, hey, the server is actually up and running. Cool. So that is it for our basic like local development Docker configuration setup. Let's move on to the next stage. All right, guys. So now we're going to be entering into a loop phase. Okay. This is the core development loop. And so what this means is we're now going to be going through every feature that we had in our documentation that we were going to build, and we are going to be building it. Now, I do this one feature at a time. The reason for that is especially if you are a vibe coder by nature, you want to have a firm understanding of what you're building, what it is giving you, and learning along the way with this thing. Now, what you're going to notice is the input of this stage, this loop, every time we loop through a feature, the input is going to be all the other stuff we made, right? So we are now building on top of what we have, and we're starting to use that momentum. We're going to start building stuff pretty fast now, realistically. And so this methodical approach, in my opinion, this loop we're going through is what's going to separate the founders of tomorrow that can actually use these tools and build real stuff that's not stupid from the wannabes who use Lovable one time and then say vibe coding's kind of dumb. So this is going to take discipline, and we're going to be looping through and looping through and looping through, but you need to remember the full scope context, 1,000-foot view of what we're doing. We're going from someone that likely not trained as a traditional software engineer that can now build pretty technical stuff. And we need to view that responsibly. We don't want to just go out there and start slinging shit around and creating vulnerabilities and not knowing what we're building, okay? This is a tool to allow us to evolve into the next version of ourselves. So let's treat it with that respect and take this as a methodical approach. So we have 4 agents that we're going to use in this stage, okay? So we're going to be using 4 agents in this stage. The first is going to be our backend engineer. We're going to have our front-end engineer. we're going to have our security analyst, and then we have our QA analyst. Okay, so we're going to be using all of these in a loop where we build the back end, we build the front end, we run it through a security check, and then we run QA and testing on it. So the backend engineer is going to be our database schemas, our tables, building the API endpoints, all of that type of stuff. The front-end engineer is going to be translating all of those UX guidelines and the user stories into something actually functional. And then the security engineer is going to be checking for vulnerabilities, and the QA engineer is going to be building and running tests. So that being said, here is our first command. And again, we're going to go feature by feature. I'm going to start with the authentication so that the user can actually log into this thing. So we're going to invoke the backend engineer agent to work on the forecast backend. The inputs for this agent are any of the necessary configuration files found in the main root, right? So any of the configs that it's going to need, as well as the details found in our architecture output and our actual feature that we're working on. In this case, that's the user authentication feature. So I'm just going to double specify that we are only building the features from our user authentication feature. And then we are going to say go. And so we can see our to-do list right out of the gate. So setting up the FastAPI project, configuring Supabase, implementing the user registration, creating the GraphQL schema for the user authentication, setting up the middleware for the JWT authentication, implementing secure password handling, creating the database migrations for the user profiles, rate limiting as like a security precaution, error handling, and the user session management. It's going to go out and it's going to do all of this. Now, something I want to point out to you guys is as this thing is going, I am reviewing, at least for my own understanding and my own learning, what is being built specifically at each stage. So when it pops up and says, hey, do you want me to build the configuration.py file? I'm going to actually read through and understand what's going on, right? Here's another example. It's building a security module. And so I am going to go through and I'm going to read this thing and I'm going to make sure that I at least have a conceptual understanding of what it is trying to do. That being said, let's let this thing go about its work. All right, guys, really brief update. So this thing just finished. That probably took, 20 minutes. It took about 20 minutes for that thing to go through and build out the entire backend for that. And now it is writing tests. So it's going to test everything that it just built. And it, which is really cool, it automatically invoked our QA test engineer that we have. So pretty cool. It knows to like intelligently use that. All right, guys. So since this is currently in the middle of running those tests, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spin up a separate Claude Code instance, which I like to do to keep track of things. And I am going to give the same exact command that we gave to the backend, but I'm going to tell it to start building the front end for it while those tests are kind of doing their thing in the background. So similar as before, invoke the front end engineer to implement the authentication service. The backend's already built. Tests are being generated. Relevant documentation is in that architecture output that we had, and the detailed feature breakdown for authentication is inside of this. Any other necessary configuration files are going to be found, as always, just like in the actual project root. So we are going to say go. And then if we pop back over here, this is still writing all of the different tests that we have on the to-do list. So I'm going to let both of these things do their thing, and we'll hop back at the next relevant point to do so. All right, guys, so this back-end testing thing is almost done. It wrote all of these tests. The last thing that it's doing, and this is just important context for you guys, which is why I have it here, is that it created this run tests script in the back-end repository, which means basically anytime we run this script, it will run all of these tests. So think now in the context of us going to deploy this thing into production. Well, first we want to run the tests, right? We want to run everything and make sure that none of these user flows have now broken. If we go and change something in the back end, we want to make sure that like the user registration flow isn't now broken, right? And so that's the intent of this. And so the output of this QA engineer are going to be a lot of files that specifically deal with writing and running tests, okay? And so if we were to go actually look at that real quick, it should be inside of our tests directory. We can see this run tests script. And so if we were to go in and look at this, we can see it is running. It's basically pulling in and running all of the tests that we have in this repository or in this directory. And so if this thing failed, we would be notified that, hey, this script has failed and You do not want to push this, in fact, into production. And now the last piece this backend engineer is doing is it's now running a security analyst. So it is making sure that we have everything we would need in place, not everything, but a lot of stuff that we would need in place to make sure that the app is secure, right? For example, if we need to revoke a token, that we have the capacity to do that. All right, guys, so I realized when I kicked this thing off, and it was like halfway through its whole thing, that I didn't actually provide a lot of the relevant files that we had made, right? I did not provide the app design system, the implementation guide, or the user journey guide, which are all relevant pieces of context for that front-end engineer to have. And so I want to go back and make sure this is all integrated in. And so that's what I am going to do. I'm going to go up here. I'm going to say exactly that and then hit enter and let it run. So I'm going to say, I forgot to give you some critical context before my last message. Please update the build based on the below documentation. Okay, and then I'm getting the app design system, the implementation guide, and the user journey guide. And then the last thing that I'm going to say, actually, I'll let that run real quick, and then we'll come back. And so we can see here just from the to-do list, color and typography tokens were not in place, the loading states and animations, how to properly handle errors based on the documentation, and that entire onboarding flow was all part of this, and none of that was in there because I forgot to provide it. And so it's going to go through, and it is going to do all of that. All right, guys, so the front end just made those updates. It was actually pretty quick. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually compact the context on this one, because what I want, oh, I got an error on it. I don't know why I'm getting that. I was going to compact it down, but clearly that didn't work. So we will ignore that for a second. And then this thing is still just doing its security fixes. So once that is done, we will go and we'll try to test this authentication flow and make sure it is working. All right, guys, so last thing we're doing before we try to turn this thing on is that we need to run the initial migration, meaning we need to make sure that all these tables that we configured in the backend are actually in Supabase, right? So we need to create all of them. And so we're going to run this initial migration, and we'll create a script to be able to run these things moving forward. So I'm going to just let this thing go through and do all that. And so we can see when we log into Supabase right now, this is entirely empty, right? This is empty. There aren't any tables in here other than this first Alembic version. And so once this thing runs, we'll see this get populated with all of our tables for the project. And there we go. So that thing ran. Now we can see all of the tables inside of our project, right? So if we were to go look at the chat messages, for example, we have our ID, our session ID, the content, like all that stuff that we had looked at earlier now actually exists in the database, which is cool. So from here, what we're going to do now is let's go try to actually launch this project. And hopefully we don't have any more errors. So we will come into here and we will try to boot up our project. Okay. And we're having some sort of errors with the database with some imports. And so again, I'm just going to copy this up to here. We'll paste it in, and then we will come back in a second once this is fixed. All right, so in order to test this off, we're going to hop on in, and we are going to build our backend. So this means the Python backend is running on our computer. And now the next thing we need to do is we need to go into our front end directory. And what we're going to need to do is we need to build the Expo app that we have. So what that means is we need to first make sure we have all of our modules installed, which they are, and then we need to start up the Expo server. So we're going to do npx expo start, and then we're going to open, in this case, the iOS debugger, or simulator rather. Okay, we can see this thing booting up. I imagine it'll fail, but let's see if it gets it. And there we go. So now we're going to have to go through and fix some of these errors. It looks like we have some basic syntax errors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into VS Code. I'm going to just clear out of this, and then I am going to start debugging the front end. So I'll give it this one, and we'll see if that fixes the build. If it doesn't, we'll come back and we'll just keep debugging this stuff together. All right, so now we have some other bundling issues. We're probably going to go back and forth with a few bundling issues, to be honest, with like logos not being there and things like that. So I will just resolve these, and if we run into anything that's more involved than me just telling it 50 times to resolve the bundling issues, then we'll hop in and look at it. But if not, we'll see you in the app. All right, guys, so what I'm realizing is that we need to run that same DevOps command now for our front end, right? Because we only use that on the back end to get the Docker file ready. We need to make sure that the front end repo has everything it needs, like environment files and things like that. So we are going to say, run the DevOps engineer agent on the forecast front end to make sure we're ready for local development work. For example, environment files and such will be needed. Make sure to reference, and then we want to reference our architecture right there. So we're gonna let this run, get all of our configuration set up, and then we'll be good to go. All right, guys, just keeping you in the loop. The last piece that we're going through here is I invoked the senior front-end engineer again, just to make sure that everything is set up and good to rock with. So once this thing is done running, we will run it from the front end. All right, guys, so we got this thing loading up. We have our back end running over here. We have this running over here. And then when we popped open our simulator, we're getting this unmatched route error, which means basically when our front end engineer was going through and building all of the stuff, they either placed everything in the wrong route or they never hooked it together, which I think is most likely the case, that these providers were just or the stacks within the provider were just empty. So we're just going through and trying to resolve some of these errors. And then once all of these get fixed, we will be good to go. So again, it's just going to be another little back and forth trying to figure this stuff out. All right, guys, and so this is what we got. Now, I will say I'm not in love with this. We will update this later, but let's just test the actual sign-up process and see what we have so far. So get started. Again, we have some styling issues here, but that's fine. So email address, get good or vibe trying. Okay, okay. Password. It's got a little bit too much haptic feedback kind of going on, which it's not. I don't even remember what I just made this. Oh, and that looks like a little. Oh, there we go. Is that? God damn it. These passwords do match. I'm gonna pause something real quick. All right, so we got a little problem here just because this does in fact match. So we need to fix this validation error. It's going to be one thing. So let's go back and clear out our context and say, in the authentication flow, the password validation is not correct. The passwords do match, but it's saying they don't. Also, please take the UI user feedback a bit less, not less serious, that's not what I want to say. Also, the component doesn't give the user a chance to correct their passwords before indicating there is an error. For example, as soon as I start typing, it says passwords do not match, which disrupts the flow. Please address and fix that. And what I was referring to there specifically is like anytime I type a character, it wants to like, you know, it just does this thing and it's like, come on, give me a chance to at least type it in, guys. So I'm going to let this thing go through and find out why this validation's not working, and then we'll go to continue and see what that onboarding flow looks like. And so the error that it found, just for context here, is that it was basically saving the password state the moment the form was initialized. And so it was comparing it basically like whatever your password was against like a non-existent password. And so it just needs to update that, and then it's going to go through and it's going to make these other changes, and then we should be good. All right, and so it definitely made some improvements. So that whole, when I was typing in the first password, it wasn't doing that like kind of annoying shift back and forth. Now the validation works, so we can go to continue. And then we get into this initial cooking experience flow. The UX and the UI is obviously going to need to be addressed. I'll go back through, but let's just confirm if this is actually working. So it's going to go through now the onboarding experience. So what is our cooking experience? We'll say I cook regularly. Okay, create account. And then we got an authentication failure. So let's see why that might have happened. And so we did not get any sort of errors on the back end. So we're going to need to add logging in place to see why this is happening. Okay, clearing out because we don't need that context. All right, guys, I'm trying to debug another issue that I'm realizing is cropping up, which is at some point, and I don't know when it happened, to be honest, a lot of the app files started getting placed inside of this source directory, but then I have all of these other duplicate files in like the app directory, and then I'm like setting, types and utilities in like multiple places. And so I am switching the model to Claude Opus to make sure I debug through this thing thoroughly and make sure I have all of the right files in place. And so I'm going to get this handled before I finish the authentication stuff. And then we will hop back in and finalize that authentication flow. All right, guys, so we can go through, we've brushed up all these bugs and we can test this account creation flow. Making up an email, don't try to email me there because it is not real. Okay, we accept, go to continue. Now the onboarding flow is not fully hooked up, but if we create this account, we can see that it successfully authenticates us. It has our user ID, has a bunch of stuff getting logged here into the console. Now, if we were to pop back out into Supabase, we can see that the user is successfully created inside of the database. So the user authentication is basically working. We're able to sign in, right? We can register. We can log in as a user. So if we were, for example, to go log out now, and then we wanted to refresh this, we flip back, we could go test the actual sign in flow. Okay, so sign in. No, we can't. Okay, so the sign in service is not working, and the error is that the email is not confirmed. Okay, so that means there's a toggle that we have on inside of our policies where you can say that the user basically has to have logged in already. And so if I was to come in here and go all the way down, I could confirm the user. Oh no, because it's going to be sending it through to my local machine. Can't do that. We might be able to manually confirm the user, or we should be able to also just toggle the option for it. Okay, so inside of users, we have the sign-in providers. There's this option that they have to confirm their email. Let's try to turn that off real quick. Okay, and now if I was to go back in and try to sign in again, and obviously there's a few other things we need to fix with, like it's not, the styling and stuff isn't pulling through. Let's see what happens here. There we go. So we're able to log in. We're able to sign up. We're able to log in. So as far as like very basic authentication stuff goes, that's good, but we still need to debug this user flow issue where it is not doing the onboarding the right way. And so that is what I'm going to continue moving through and debugging here. And then once this is fixed, we will test that full flow end to end and make sure all of like our styles are actually matching and all of that type of stuff. All right, so we're testing it out again. It just made a fix. It found that there's issues with how the routing was working. So Expo has its own routing conventions and it was not routing properly, allegedly. So let's see what happens. So no, we're having some sort of type error that is still happening here. So we'll keep diving into this one. All right, guys, so we have this pretty much debugged through at this point. Okay, we accept, we hit create account. Okay, it does, there's like a little glitch you'll see there that we need to fix where it's redirecting to this other screen temporarily, but we'll go through this onboarding experience. We're gonna need to beef up like what equipment it's actually asking for. Oh, I actually didn't realize we have all these down here. So we'll need to fix some of these, but if I went through, I'll say a stovetop, I've got an oven, I've got all this. Yep, I've got all of this. Yes. I have all that. Very nice. And we have this nice little onboarding thing. So it's basically a tutorial, right? So we take a photo of any dish, instant magic, sous vide chef, we hit get started, and then boom. Now we're into like the main route of our app, right? So we go through that full onboarding phase and we are in this main screen, which we haven't built this out yet, which is why it looks very vanilla, because it's just the template Expo file that we have there. So really the last thing that I'm going to do here, guys, before we move on, is come back in here. Just going to clear this out for a second. And I'm going to say, I'm actually going to look really quick in my repo for where that onboarding flow kicks in. So it's probably in my components. I'm just going to look through some of this stuff. So I think it's in this file where this is happening, or it's in the welcome. No, it might even be in this file. It's in one of these files in the auth folder. And so I'm going to have this debug to help me understand and fix why my app does the following. And I'm just going to explain what happens. One, user enters email and password. It temporarily redirects to email verified state, temporarily redirects to some basic outdated version of the first onboarding flow screen, permanent. Okay, so I'm just gonna have it debug that issue that we are running into. And then from there, there's really only one last thing that we need to fix, which is we have the users being created inside of our authentication, like inside of Supabase. Like the user is being created, but they're not being linked into the actual database table. Okay, so I need to get it such that when the authentication is complete, it's actually inserting the user into the table. That's the last piece I'm gonna do. And then from there, we should be good to move on to the other features. All right, guys, so this thing is rolling through. I'm trying to fix this. It has this weird, like, glitchy redirect thing that's driving me crazy. So I'm trying to just figure that out, going back and forth a little bit. Nothing to write home about. Just chatting back and forth and explaining what is happening to it and trying to be as descriptive as I can so that it can fix it. And then number two, I told it that we're not properly inserting the users into the database like we looked at, right? So we're not creating the users in the user table. We're only creating them in this area here. And so it is updating our backend so that when that happens and the authentication is successful with Supabase, it's actually inserting that user into our primary table for users. So that is what it is working on right now. As soon as this is done, and just quick little aside, actually, because we're here, anytime we're modifying like database schemas and things like that, we typically have to run a migration, meaning we need to like safely migrate our database to this new format for the database and make sure that things don't break. And so that is what this is doing here. So once this is all done, we will fully test this thing through and wrap this section up. All right, so we're testing this flow one last time. I just entered in name, email, phone. Now I'm gonna go through this onboarding process. Okay, fully moved through. So that's good. That weird glitch thing that it was doing is gone, which is nice. Now let's check to see the last thing, which is user is getting created in authentication, and then is it being added into the user table? It is not. All right, guys, so let's zoom out for a second, 1,000-foot view, because we've been doing a lot of stuff. We were just in that authentication flow for a pretty long time. So where are we at now? So initially we went through, we did all of that project planning, right? We built the architecture, we did like our design, our UX UI, we did some DevOps stuff, we fleshed out what all of these features need to look like. We built the actual front end user authentication and onboarding flow, but then it's plopping us into this still like vanilla, untouched Expo app. And so one little pre-step that we are going to take right now is that I want to just have like the overarching app routing in place. And what I mean by that is when I exit out of that onboarding flow that we had, we saw that we were just going into this like vanilla looking like Expo, hey, start, explore here, whatever. We don't want to be there. We want to be in our actual like app routing where our navigation is in the bottom. The screens can still be blank because we're going to fix those when we build the actual features, but we want that overarching navigation in place. And so I am going to do that right now. I'm going to invoke that front end engineer. We're going to get the app nav in place. This should be a very quick step. And then from there, we'll move into each of those features that we had in order. So what that means is we'll go through the photo capture, identifying like the taste profile of that meal, the recipe generation, the AI chat, and then some basic setting options. And then from there, the main app is pretty much going to be complete. So let's move through and create that actual navigation. Okay, so we're going to invoke the front engineer to set up the initial app navigation bar. We already have a functional authentication service. Do not touch that, right? I don't want to go in and changing any of that stuff. I just want the wireframing of this initial navigation so that we can start building features with them. Okay, and then I'm just gonna paste in all of our relevant documentation that we have. So the architecture, it might need that. The app design system, so that whatever it builds is in line with our our design system. And then it really just needs the user journey guide so it understands the flow and can abstract out what the navigation for that means. And so I'm also telling it, like, do not go and try to build all the nested navigation, right? Because inside of each of these features, there's going to be different screens and things, but I'm going to leave that to those specific feature generations. So I just want this like really initial basic app navigation. So I'm gonna let it ride on that, and then we'll come back and hopefully it works. All right, guys, so this is the screen that we land on now when our initial registration completes. So it didn't exactly follow me telling it not to build other stuff, but it is what it is. So we have some like really basic screens here: a profile, a chat, a recipe. This is not though what I wanted my bottom nav to look like. I wanna have like 4 nav options down here. The recipes one is fine, but I wanna have one that indicates like starting a new one with like a nice elevated like start a new recipe button in the middle right here. So that's what I'm going to prompt it for next. So the first thing that I'll do is I'm gonna just make sure I'm in the correct model. I'm using Sonnet, which is fine. Just gonna really quickly compact our context. So again, I'm trying to show you like real workflows. So this is what I would do at this point, because me just trying to explain what I wanna have, I know I'll get something wrong. And so I'm trying to go through, I'm using Mobbin, and I'm specifically looking for a top navigation bar. This is kind of the closest, this one right here that has like this little icon in the middle. That's the closest to what I'm looking for that I see right now. But I'm basically looking through these to find one that is more precisely what I want. I have a really clear idea in my mind of what I want this thing to look like. But again, I want to find a specific example if I can, so that I can prompt that through to the system. So I'm gonna just pause while I scroll through these, and then once I find the one I'm looking for, I will show it to you guys. Oh, and there we go, it's right here actually. Something like this, right? I really like this, how this nav's done at the bottom. So I'm gonna do that, and then I'm gonna pop back in, and I'm gonna just drag that in from my files. Okay, so I dragged in that from my computer, and then I'm gonna say, update my nav bar to more closely follow the structure of the attached image. I specifically want to have 4 tabs at the bottom, with the middlemost tab being an elevated looking new recipe icon. See if we get something good with that. All right, guys, so I'm just going through like a really quick design kind of brainstorming, because I don't like how this navigation is turning out, and I want to get some different thoughts and ideas on what this kind of should look like. And so all I'm doing is asking the system in planning mode to look at the user journeys plus our like UX principles and guidelines, and help me come up with a few different concrete concepts for what this nav could look like. And then once we're done with this, we'll implement whichever one we like, and then we will move on to the rest of the features. All right, guys, so we have a few different options here. I'm leaning towards concept 1. So experiments, which are like recipe attempts, work in progress, like your kind of like a list history that you can click into each one and then maybe chat back and forth and try to refine things with. Then we have this My Kitchen, which will be like cooking timers, things you've cooked recently, things like that. Cookbook, which is going to be things that we've already finalized. We talked about that earlier. And then we have our profile, and then in the middle we'll have this little kind of elevated create option. So that, I think, is what we're going to end up going with. So I'll have this implemented, and then we will kick off into the next series of features. All right, guys, so our app is working. I styled this middle button a little bit more to be what I wanted it to be. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to commit all of these changes that we have, and then we will move on to the next piece of the process. If you're not someone that uses Git regularly, you need to get into the habit of every time you complete a feature or any meaningful change, really, commit the change so that we can always revert back here. If I was to go make some other change now and it fucks up my whole repository in some way, I want to be able to revert back, okay? So we're going to do that. We're going to add the files that we created, and then we are going to commit it. And then from there, we will be good to move on to the next features. So we'll say app navigation is functional. There we go. So next feature that we're going to build, I want to start off first with this ability to actually capture the photo, store the photo, and do all of that type of stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to kick off that backend agent to, again, build all the backend infrastructure for this photo capturing, all the APIs and everything we're going to need. And then from there, we will work to build the front end for it. So this is what we're doing. Kick off the backend engineer for the photo capture feature. Make sure to reference these specific files. So I pass in the actual documentation for that feature. I pass in the product requirements from that product manager, which again is going to specify how this, like what the acceptance criteria for this feature actually is. And then the architecture so that it knows that like we're using Cloudinary and all of those sorts of things. So we're going to say go, and then we'll come back once we have a meaningful point to discuss. Now, the one thing that you should be doing here, by the way, which I obviously did not just do, but we're just going to let it run, is that you should check out into like a new feature branch to build this so that we can then merge that feature back into like our main development branch. We don't want to always just be like vibe coding on our main branch. It's going to make things messy. So we should have done a checkout to a new branch and then built all of the photo stuff in there, tested it once it works, then merge it back into our dev branch and create a pull request from there. But we didn't do that. We'll do that on the next one. All right, guys, so the backend agent just completed. And so now we're going to go through and we are going to throw the front end agent in. The one thing that I did, by the way, is I went through and I created a new branch for this. So after it complete, I had it commit the changes, create a new branch. So all the front end stuff we're going to build is now on a new branch. So I also compacted the token or the window so that we just have a summary of what we just did. And so we're going to go through and we are going to tell it, I want you to invoke the front end engineer to build out the photo capture feature. Backend is already built and tested. And then I'm going to link to the relevant docs. And then we are going to hit go and we are going to let it do its thing. All right, guys, so we are in the app now. We debugged a few things. And now we're testing this uploading flow for this photo, right? So we have down here, we have our experiments, we got our kitchen, we got our cookbook, profile. None of this is what it's meant to be, right? We really just worked on the nav and then we built out this photo upload feature. So not really worried about all of this stuff. I want to see how this works. Okay, so we click on here. Now this would be us actually using the camera. So if we have this on our phone, this would be using the actual camera to take a photo. We also built a functionality to select from from the phone, from the photo library. And so I'm going to pick an image that I uploaded of some fish. So we're going to upload that photo. And then we have some options in here where we can enhance it if we want to, which is kind of cool. But then let's just say that we like it and it looks good. Then we get brought to this describe your dish screen. So this is where we would put in like what was on the menu. So we could say, I don't know, a little bit spicy and pops with umami. I don't know, something like that. Then we have this little slider down here where we can basically describe this is how like sweet it was. This is how salty it was. It was kind of spicy, tons of umami, not bitter, not sour. And there's some advanced options which don't work. That's fine. Then we click generate recipe. And so it's doing this like image upload kind of thing. And then it goes through. Now it's analyzing the dish. Okay, it has this little factoid thing down here. So if we pop out of this for a second while that's going, what we can do now is pop over into our Cloudinary where this stuff's being stored and refresh. And boom, we can see that the image was uploaded. So that is working now. The photo feature, like the ability to actually upload the image, is working. Now it looks like it's kind of hanging out in this analyzed dish space. So we want to go through and try to figure out what is happening with that because I have no clue. So that is that. So trying to figure out why this is broken. And when I go into the actual like server logs, there are definitely some errors in here, but I don't remember if this is like a fresh error or not. And so what I'm going to do is reload this, okay, so that we can go back in. We're just going to try this one more time and going to clear out all of our logs and see what happens. So I'm going to upload it. We're going to go in, okay. We're going to say it looks good. Give it a little name there, 123, 123, 123. I'm going to change one of these slider fields, generate recipe. Okay, seems to not, that one's not even processing the image now. So what I'm going to do real quick is go back and I'm going to try to log out and log back in and see if this does anything for us. Okay, so we're gonna log out. Okay. All right, guys, so we're in here testing this thing out one last time. This would be like my menu description goes here. Okay, we come down, we say this was actually had so much umami. Generate recipe, goes through, boom, and then we get like a finalized dish. Obviously, this isn't pulling through because we didn't work on any of this, but it is going through and creating that recipe. And so if we were to go look in our database now, we can see this entry just came through, okay? So this has my menu description, which we just wrote in. It's got the user ID that generated this thing. The recipe has an ID right here. So we're starting to store all of that data. Now, the one thing that I noticed is that all of those little taste things that we did are not storing anywhere in here. So that's the one last thing really that we would need to add. So when we're in here and these little sliders get configured, right here, when these sliders get configured for describing our dish, this needs to store somewhere. So that's the last thing we'll do, and then we are actually on to the next stage. All right, guys, so that was pretty straightforward. Just told it exactly what the case was, that this was not syncing that slider, and so that's what it went through and updated. So now we can see in here that those slider scores do get saved into this taste profile field on the recipe. So really the last thing that I want to work on as part of this feature so that it'll be considered wrapped. So the photo is uploading, it's storing into Cloudinary, which is cool. The only other thing though that I kind of don't like, and we need to build the functionality for it, is that in our code base, when we went through and built this thing, we built this service for OpenAI where it can actually process the image and get an understanding of what is in the image. And we're not actually calling this anywhere. And so the way that it should work is that the photo gets uploaded, right? So uploaded to Cloudinary, and then it needs to get actually analyzed. Right now it just goes, okay, and the rest is done, and just kind of flies through it. And so what I want to do is I just want to hook in these last pieces here. And we'll need to come in later and like dial in the actual recipe that gets made and everything, but I want to set it so that it can in fact use this analyze food images function that we have, and then it can take that output and it can use it to generate the recipe. So that is really the last thing left in this feature, and then we'll be able to go in and start building out everything else. So basically what I'm telling this thing, use the front-end engineer to connect this create your recipe kind of screen that we're on. So I want to make sure that it's connected so that it actually triggers this analyze dish or analyze image. What is it called? Is it called dish or image actually? It should be image, analyze food image. So I'm gonna go up here and make sure I actually give it the right function, analyze food image function, which exists in the OpenAI service, which is right here. Please make sure the API exists on the back end. I want to make sure the backend engineer actually built it. If it does not, have the backend engineer create it. If it does, have the front-end engineer hook into it. And then make sure that it's using GraphQL and all the things it needs to do. Make sure that it's properly passing the Cloudinary URL to the OpenAI service. And then as far as the output, just put it in the same spot that we had our other outputs getting placed. So we're going to let this thing rock on through, and then we'll come back. All right, guys, so it's going through and trying to create this stuff, but I'm not sure. I think we may have already built this functionality. So we have this like initiate recipe generation, for example. So I want to make sure that we don't actually have this in place already before we go and build this thing. And so I'm going to actually interrupt its edit right now. And I'm going to say, before you continue, read this file and make sure we don't already have the functionality in place for kicking off the image analysis via the OpenAI service. If it doesn't exist, you may continue. All right, guys, so I was looking through the documentation of everything we have here, and I think I may have lied to you guys because the photo capture and upload was the feature. So it wasn't actually that we need to process this thing in the background or do anything. It was literally just that mechanism for capturing the photo on the device or picking one from the media library, being able to upload it to Cloudinary, have it store in Cloudinary. That was all for this feature, okay? So that brings a wrap to the second feature, right? So we've done our user authentication and we have done the photo capture, which means the next part that we really should be having to work on is this right here, which is going to be actually processing and generating a recipe out of this. And so that is what we are going to do. So what we're going to be saying, hey, we want you to invoke the backend engineer to build the recipe generation feature. Please note, we're only building out the recipe generation feature. The goal of this output would be that the user uploads their photo and a recipe pops out the other side. Make sure we are dynamically pulling in relevant notes from the recipe database model, right? And so what I'm referring to is we started storing all of this stuff in here, like the menu description, the type of cuisine, the tasting notes, all of that stuff is here, and we want to make sure that it pulls through. Okay, so yeah, we're gonna let this thing rock and roll, and then we will pop back and see what we got. All right, guys, so the backend engineer just finished, and so it enhanced the OpenAI service a little bit, improved some recipe processing stuff. The one thing I didn't like is that it added in a few additional features, which I wasn't asking for. So that's kind of annoying. I added a Claude memory to say, like, do not do that in the future. But that being said, we're going to go through now and we are going to prompt it to tie this all together. So we'll say here is the relevant documentation. Paste that all in. And then again, we're linking to the system architecture so it knows what it's doing. We have the detailed feature breakdown for this feature right here. User journey, so they can understand the flow that the user is going to go through. Product manager, so it understands the requirements for the feature. And then app design, again, so that it knows what it is going to go and build. Now, actually, the one thing I think we should do before we run this is compress the context down. So I'm going to actually just copy this real quick, and then I'm going to backspace it all, and I'm just going to clear the context, and then, or I'll probably compact it and then move forward. Okay, so this thing is now off to the races and running. So we will come back and check it out. All right, so we found, so this front end engineers is still running, but I tried to boot up and found that there's some sort of GraphQL error on the back end. So I'm going to try to have this solve in the background while we're working on the front end code. All right, guys, so we are back in our app here, and we want to test this whole other processing backend that we just built. Remember, because again, just for context, what we just built, it's the system that will actually go through and send this to OpenAI's model and process it and create a recipe from it. So we want to see if this is even going to work. Not very fishy. Okay, change some of the sliders. Say it was a little spicy, had a lot of umami. Generate recipe, let's see what happens. Okay, it uploads the photo. Now it's trying to analyze the dish, which should be the image processing endpoint with OpenAI. Nope, so that failed. And let's see what the failure actually is. Boom, boom, boom. This doesn't give us anything. Let's go into our Docker and see what the problem actually is. Failed to analyze image. The model GPT vision does not exist. That is not a model name, and that should be swapped. So I'm gonna try to run this thing one more time now. I wonder if this try again function we built actually works. Looks like it does. That's nice. Talk about a one-shot. Now that's a one-shot. All right, let's see if this thing works. It's trying to analyze our food image. It's pulling in the proper URL from Cloudinary, which is good. It's analyzing, and it failed on us. So let's see why. Why did it fail? Expected a string, found none type. All right, well, that doesn't seem like that's what you want to find. Let's see if there are any other errors here. Trace back in the upload py file, generated recipe. So it's calling this function to generate the recipe, which would seemingly indicate that the image processing might have worked. I could be making that up. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to copy all of this down from the error, And we're going to go paste this bad boy in, and we're going to see what it says. All right, so here we are, pasting it in. And by the way, guys, something that would be good to show you while we're here. These are those sentry logs. So you remember earlier when we first set up the project, we set up sentry logs. And this is what this is good for, right? So imagine this is like in production and things are running, and we want to be able to see when people are running into these types of problems in an actual production environment, right? That's very important for us to know. And it will also tell us if this is an escalating problem, right? So this one, for example, we're getting a lot of requests that are this specific type of error. And so we could hop in and we can try to see why this is actually happening, and it gives us a good jumping off point for debugging. Now, the thing that's cool here, we can search based on at least how I've set this up. I have this installed on both my React Native front end as well as my Python FastAPI. And so pretty cool because it will show us different types of errors that we're having in both of those places. But let's hop on back in and see. It claims to have fixed this, so we will test that claim. Okay, so we're gonna hop back in here. I'm gonna rerun this thing and let's see what happens now. So we're gonna go in, we're gonna choose this image out of the library. We are going to upload it. We're gonna say, so creamy. So creamy, okay? I was gonna say it was spicy as shit this time. Oh my God, I don't know what they put in there. And it had umami. All right, so let's see what happens now. Again, we'll go look at the back end. So it's gotten to the same spot. It's analyzing the food image in this OpenAI service. Oh, and we hit another error. Hopefully it's not the same exact thing. It is this none type thing again. What was it saying was the problem here? The fix has been applied. The issues that generate recipe cache key method was trying to join strings. So I'm just gonna try this real quick and see if me shutting this down and putting it back on does anything at all. See if we just try it again. And then if this fails again, I will go through a little bit of a deeper debug on this one. So let's see what we get. Probably gonna fail again. It seems like it's actually getting further along, unless I wasn't paying attention to the logs earlier, because I can see it's actually logging like how many ingredients it found. We're getting a worker timeout. Okay, so it was moving through. So that's good. It means we're not running into the same exact error over and over again, which is always good. So I'm gonna plop this in and come back. If there's anything meaningful for you guys to see, I'll turn it back on. But if not, hopefully the next time I turn this on, the feature's working. Okay, guys, so I like to read these things as they pop out sometimes. And so what it seems is the case is that we had a manual timeout set to 30 seconds inside of our project. And so it's basically saying that this is too short for the type of task we're doing. And so it's changing the length of the timeout, okay? And so hopefully this fixes it, but we'll see in a second. All right, guys, so good news. We got past that first piece. So that is good. But now we failed on the actual recipe generation. So we were able to analyze the image properly, and I could see it outputting like the list of ingredients and everything that was in here. But now we need it to obviously process the next stage properly. And so same thing, I'm gonna take this where I see the error start, which I think the error might be because of this authorization header being absent, because I had issues with that previously. So we're gonna come back down and we're just gonna copy a bunch of this, paste it in, and then see what we get as usual. Oh, on the money with this one, on the money. So the authorization header. So basically a lot of these backend routes and things like that, they have to be authorized so that someone can't just come in and start sending shit to our backend and messing things up. And so every time these requests are getting made from the front end, we have these authorization checks in place. And so obviously we're dropping that authorization check at a certain point, or rather we're not passing the authorization through. And so that's why that's failing. And so it's going to go through and hopefully update that for us. All right, guys, I'm stuck just trying to debug this one really stupid thing, and it's really pissing me off that I can't actually log out of anything here. So I'm just having this write me a really quick script, okay, which I can run to like force that function. So I can just like force log myself out in these situations instead of having to go like into devices and erase all the content settings and then re-upload the images I was using as a test. And I don't want to deal with all that. So I'm going to have it make this function where I can just force log out whoever's in the simulator at any point in time. So I'm doing that, and then this should be cleaned up and fixed, and then we'll be good to kind of test things end to end and make sure it is working, where we can actually get that recipe out the other side. All right, guys, so the processing of the recipes is working now. So we can see that we get this recipe, like kind of main recipe, like database table that we have, and then we get this ID right here for this recipe. And then we can see in these recipe steps and in the recipe ingredients and in the recipe images, we're referencing that recipe ID. And so I have an update going through where it's going to handle the fact that this thing could process for a while. And then in the next stage, we are eventually going to just have this process as like a background job. So we won't need to worry about that. But right now it's happening kind of in the actual view. So we're going to fix this last thing, and then we will kind of take a look at where we are at. All right, guys, so this thing is going through and fixing the issue that we're having in like the queues. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go kick off another agent real quick. And what I want to do specifically is I want to look at all of the screens that we have, right? So we have this experiment screen, we have my kitchen, and we have cookbook. And I want to start thinking through like what are going to actually be on these screens, right? Because if I were to click on Thai green curry, nothing happens, right? And so we still need those like detailed views and things like that. And so I am going to have the system go through, read all of our documentation, and then brainstorm for me some options for these screens, okay? And so I'm basically telling it, go brainstorm. I want 3 different options for each of these based on your understanding of the app. And then I want you to output those into a markdown file so that I can read them and pick out the one that I want to actually go with. Okay, so now that we have that kind of upload process is actually working and it uses the language model and does create a recipe, we'll worry about the little details once we get these other screens dialed in, because that UI is going to rely on what happens here. And so we have these different experiments that we have these different screen ideas that we had the system go through. So for each of these screens, it gave a few different options, and I went through and picked out the one that I liked best. So I had 3 options from each of these. So for the experiment screen, we're going with approach 1, which is this kind of like visual recipe timeline type of thing. And so basically what this means is that we're going to be just keeping track of, is this thing in like testing? Is it in progress? Was it successful? Like what does it actually look like? When the user clicks on the card, it's going to kind of expand into this full view where that food item now becomes the hero image on the next page, and then they can look at everything that's there. And then there will be this AI chat integration on that page too. So that's what we're going to go with for the experiment screen. On the My Kitchen screen, there were a few different options. Some of them were a little too complicated. It wanted to do like inventory management at the person's house and things like that, which I'm not going to build that feature right now. That would be way too crazy. And so we're going to go with this idea of like a stat-based activity tracking dashboard. So we'll be able to see like recent activity and number of like successful recipes and recipes that are in progress, and just like a general kind of like home page activity feed type of thing. And then for the cookbook screen, we went with their second option, which is this like interactive kind of collection of all of our recipes that we have. And then for the AI chat feature, we're going to leave this till the next video. So these are the screens that we are going to go and implement now. So let's back out for a second and talk about where we are in this process right now, because we've been in the code for, at least for me, what seems like a very, 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 very long time. So where are we? So we kicked off the project initially. We did all that brainstorming with the product manager, the system architect. We did some basic DevOps stuff at the beginning. And now we've been going through this iterative looping process of backend engineer, front-end engineer, and then fixing bugs that kind of crop up along the way. And we did that to create a few features. First was our user authentication so that we could actually log in and use the app. Then we set up all of our tab navigation at the bottom so that we can go into different screens. Then we hopped in and built the photo generation, the photo capturing system, where we can upload a photo or take a photo. It uploads it to Cloudinary. Cloudinary can process it. Now, after we were done with that, we did some basic recipe generation where Cloudinary then sends that image to OpenAI, which can see what are the ingredients that are in there. And then based on that, plus the menu description and the taste profile that we gave it, it sends it to to OpenAI to actually generate a recipe from that. So the last major feature that we haven't built yet that we will get to next is the AI chat, right? But before we do that, we just need to go dial in all of these things because they're not 100% complete. And what I noticed was the agent actually pulled in features from other sections. So if you remember, we never actually went through the taste profile feature, but it pulled that in itself, okay? And so there was a little bit of context hopping that if you weren't paying really close attention, you might not have noticed that happen. And so what I did was I created this agent that I called Respect to Spec. Respect to Spec. And so we're gonna run this thing, and what I basically wanna get is an understanding of what are all of the features we have so far and how well do they actually match the initial feature specification. And so I have this agent that we defined that is basically this. So it's gonna go through everything and give us an understanding of what we intended to build initially versus what actually ended up being built. And so I'm gonna launch this in a new Claude instance, okay? And I am just gonna let this thing run. So we're gonna say, invoke the respect.spec.markdown agent for the photo capture, recipe generation, user authentication, and taste profile features, okay? So I just wanna have an understanding of where are we relative to those things based on all of those product requirements that we had. So I'm just gonna make sure this thing kicks off. So it is going to run that and it's gonna output its results for us inside of this project documentation. So while this is running, we're gonna hop back over here, okay? And so now what I want to do is I just wanna actually go implement these screens. And so my theory or my philosophy with this was I do not wanna go building new functionality at this point. I want to, as much as possible, use what we already have in our data models and just think about how we're gonna present it to the user. So I don't wanna go build any crazy vector embedding so that now this screen can query past chats we've had and all of that. We can think about that stuff later. I'm trying to get to a functional MVP right now. So I went through and I pruned this thing down so that we're not really doing anything super new, okay? The only thing that's gonna be new is this placeholder for AI chat functionality, okay? And so that is what we are gonna do. So I'm gonna pop back into here, okay? So I've typed out a prompt here and we're just gonna let this thing roll. But basically I said, invoke the backend engineer and the front end engineer, and I need you to go build this thing out. I do not want you building net new features. I just want you to look at this file that we had and make your decisions from there. And you need to ask me if you think you need to build a new feature specifically. So we're gonna let this thing run and then we'll come back and see what it looks like and deal with the bugs. All right guys, so this Respect to Spec agent just ran through. So let's look at what it said. So basically it's saying 6.5 out of 10 as far as matching our implementation and what we intended to build. And so let's look at what it is saying happened. So for the authentication, most of the main workflows are implemented, but it's saying that there are a few things that are only partially implemented. So the welcome screen is kind of boring. So really basic welcome screen, no real value proposition in that welcome screen. And so the impact of this is users may not understand the app value immediately and they might not choose to use it. So this is a good update just to kind of have in our back pocket. The skill level selections, so it's very basic, they're saying, so there should be better visual feedback. So a lot of these are just UI improvements, at least in the authentication and onboarding, but it's saying a few things are missing pretty much entirely. So it's saying that the tutorial screen kind of sucks, which I agree with. It's saying that the equipment selection screen that we have in the onboarding, when we're onboarding through, is not done fully, which, okay, we can go look at that. And then progress indicators through the onboarding step, it's not very clear. So that's all pretty easy for us to update. And I mean, the app onboarding does need to be solid, right? User's first experience with the app. So we should go through and update that stuff, but let's keep moving through. So in the photo capture and upload, we don't have any way really of understanding if it is a quality photo, right? So the user might take a poor photo. I would need to think about the best way to actually kind of understand this, because it's like the AI has to basically tell you if it was quality or not. So I think like maybe a warning system in the UI might make more sense for this, saying like, hey, make sure that it's clear and that you can see the food and all of that type of stuff. Enhancement tools. So again, photo enhancement tools, it's saying that they're very limited, which, you know, was the case. So missing requirements. We had moved this to the backlog, so I wouldn't consider it missing, but this was that whole photo AI guided, like, hey, is your photo good or is it not good thing? And then visual guide. So like having an actual visual overlay on the image to say, for example, like, hey, place your image, you know, place your image here, that type of stuff. So again, that's like a nice to have. So I'm not gonna lose sleep over that one. So for the menu description and taste profile, again, what is partially implemented? Again, this is tied into that piece from above where, you know, having stages to review things and understanding the quality of the image and things like that. They aren't there. Dietary considerations, I think this would be a valuable one to have in here. So this is important to implement. And then having like a final review screen before everything gets like sent off for processing. I think that's valuable too. So these two I would say are definitely probably some of the most valuable things on the list that we have so far to actually go through and implement. And then as far as the recipe generation and processing, educational content during processing, I think we could expand that. We have some of that there. Quality assessment display. Again, this relies on some of the other stuff we were talking about. So that would be like a nice to have, I think, right now. And then missing requirements. So what is entirely missing? This is similar to what we had above, where like giving people a moment to like check all the inputs before the generation actually starts. Queue position display. I don't really think we need that. I'd rather just have like a background processing with like an estimated time of completion, not like, hey, you're number 5 in the queue. Like I don't want that. And then basically what it does from here is it goes through and it breaks down like what does it consider are critical missing steps and the orders in which those things should actually be rolled out. And so after we're done with these dashboard screen things that we're working on, which you can see moving down here, we will go through and have it clean up anything from here that we thought was very critical. Hey guys, so just a quick update on where we're at. We have all these new nav screens are being generated. So we had kicked off that big project where it was going to update the front end and the back end to be able to actually create these screens that we had asked for in this nav screen design exercise thing that we had over here. So we said, hey, go like build all of this, and we don't want you building new features and all of that. And so we are just kind of rocking through that now, creating the different dashboards, hooking up the buttons. I'm basically taking this tab by tab. So this is the tab I'm going to dial in now. The experiment tab looks super ugly, so I'm going to have it go back and reference the designs there. Same thing with the cookbook. So yeah, we're working right now on this screen. All right, guys, just for context on what I am doing in the background, just now I've added a few more photos in and I'm testing, like, does this full end-to-end process actually work where we can upload the thing and get the recipe generated? So in the background, I'm doing like little tiny small tweaks, not doing anything major. If there's anything major, I will show you, and then we'll wrap up all of the small little tiny things that I tweaked. And then once this is all wrapped up and we're cool with everything, we're gonna move into that final feature, which is the AI chat component. All right, guys, so coming back on the mic here to talk about where we are at. So I've been going through in the background and making a few little updates here and there. So making sure like images render properly. Also having OpenAI store metadata about the image into our database so that I can start looking at other types of information that I might want to present to the user. We dialed in and fixed a few little errors that we were having with the actual image uploading process. So that should be working now. So we have like a basic functioning app. There are a few little tiny things though that are still bothering me a little bit, which is what I'm gonna go through and fix next. So I'm just gonna get this last little thing dialed in. Again, there's nothing like serious or major that I'm doing at this point. It's just small little tiny details here and there that I'm trying to refine and refine and refine. All right, guys, just another quick little aside since we are working on it right now. One of the things that I decided to add in here was that in this experiment feature, when you're experimenting with like a specific recipe, I wanted to like show different pieces of that recipe. So for example, showing like how long approximately this will take to cook, relative difficulty level, flavor profile that we had for it, like where does it generally fall, what are the key ingredients that you're going to need for this thing, what are the different cooking techniques that you might need to be comfortable with, nutrition facts, a bunch of stuff like that. And one of the things that's cool with working with some of these language models is that you can force the schema that you want it to reply to you with. And so that's what we're doing now in this OpenAI service that we've been working with a little bit. We're saying, hey, when you reply to me, this is the specific schema and like fields, like key value pairs that I want returned to me. So for example, you need to return a field called prep time minutes that has a number in it, for example. And then we do that, we repeat that. So how long is the prep time? How long is the cook time? How many servings? What are the ingredients? What type of cuisine is it? Tags, equipment that's going to be needed. All of this stuff, we're basically forcing the language model to return it back to us, which is going to make it nice because then we can actually use it in our front end. All right, guys, so we're going to test an end-to-end workflow here. It's not 100%, but it's getting pretty close, okay? So we're going to go through. I deleted everything from our database. Okay, then we get landed into this onboarding experience. Pick all of our equipment. Now the reason this is important is that once we get into the later videos that we'll do in the series, we're going to dial in that ChatGPT or OpenAI prompt to make sure it's considering all of this equipment. Okay, now I have this little helper function in here that adds all the test photos I have to the database so that I can actually use it. Okay, so we're on the home screen. This is what it looks like when it's blank. Then we can come through and we can select this mussels dish. Okay, we'll call it mussel delight. There's a name for this type of thing. I'd forget it, so I'm just gonna say it's an Indian curry and mussels. I don't think that's even close to what this actually is. It's a other thing, but it is what it is. So we'll come through here, change a few things. We have our dietary considerations. So let's say that like you're dairy free and you can't eat, I don't know, say dairy free and nut free. And then we'll say it needs to be low sugar. And then we could add other notes in here, review and generate. Okay, now we have this little final review stage where we can go through and make sure this is kind of what we want it to look like. And then we can say generate. And now it is going to go through. Okay, starting the recipe, generating the recipe. Now I should be able to exit out of this and it should process anyway. If we go back, I'm gonna go way back to the beginning screen we were on. Yep, and we can see that it's pending here. One thing that I'm gonna need to test, I think this says ready to test before it actually is ready to test. But let me take you through and show some of the other features that I added in. Okay, so once this is actually ready, so we have this like intelligence summary, right? So just general intelligence about the recipe on the whole. And so this thing needs to be updated because it's basically giving everything a 70% match. So I'm gonna change that so it actually makes sense. But it says ready to test, so it's giving us a little bit of an overview, right? So it's, hey, it's a medium difficulty dish, 35 minutes, this many servings. This is the initial description that we gave. It categorizes the cuisine. This is part of that OpenAI like structured output where it's going to categorize it. The different ingredients that we are going to need. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Has this little overview, flavor technique profile. I need to fix this because it's not, right? This is supposed to be out to the actual edges of things. So we'll come through and fix that later. It's breaking down the type of equipment we're going to need, right? So you need a large pot, a knife, a cutting board, and a spoon. Cool. Nutritional intelligence, so a serving. You might want to specify what a serving actually is. It has this like pairing, right? So if you wanted to pair this with like a wine or something, pretty cool. And then success indicators. This is kind of cool, like helpful little pro tips and things that you should be aware of. Now the feature we're going to hook up in the next video is going to be all of these chat-based features. So right now, if we click I'm ready to try it, basically it converts this into a recipe in progress now. So testing in progress. Then we have this little shopping list we can take with us to go shop for everything we need. And then it gives us the basic instructions, okay? And then we can rate this thing. So we could say, hey, this was a 4-star, a 5-star, 5-star. We could say way undersalted and lacked umami. Okay. So we could come through and like save notes for ourselves and then come back later and refine this with AI once we have that like AI feature built out. Okay. Another small thing, we'll need to persist these notes. So when the user backs out, because this is meant to be like an iterative thing. So we'll need to make sure that if they type stuff in here that it actually gets saved. But we could again say like lacked salt, right? And then once that's all done, we can add it to our cookbook, which that's actually the last thing I hadn't tested. But once that is complete, then it's going to be added inside of our cookbook and we'll be able to interact with it there. So other little thing, the profile, this isn't actually hooked up to anything yet. So that will be like a small little feature that we'll have to do where we actually hook up these preferences to our database and everything. But that should be pretty straightforward for us to do. Okay, this is a finalized recipe that we have. Okay, so all the instructions and the ingredients. Another little thing we need to add in there is the notes that the user left, and then we'll have some chatting functionality in here too. So pretty cool. Okay, and then we can see it here. And then there will be, once we get a lot of things in here, functionality like, hey, surprise me, pick a random dish, be able to sort and do all of this type of stuff too. So that's pretty much it for like this super basic, hey, the major components of this thing outside of that AI chat are at least functional. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run that respect to spec agent one more time that we have built to go through everything that we have and see like what major issues do we still have that we know we are going to need to improve. Okay, so I want to have one last understanding of what that is so that when we get to stage 3, which is going to be a big refinement stage, that entire video is going to be about refining this thing, polishing it, making sure all of the flows make sense, all the errors are handled, all of those sorts of things are going to be in the third video. A lot of those things that we've done in the past on this channel, like self-healing UIs and really analyzing the user experience and the UI and updating it and all that type of stuff, again, that's going to be in the third video. So stay tuned for that if that's something you're interested in, if you want to see how this is going to get from where it is to something that really pops and feels a lot smoother. It's going to come down to all of those little details. All right, so that's what we got from our kind of feature feedback analyst is everything. So if you remember last time we ran this, it was like a 6.5. So we bumped up 1 whole point. So that's nice. So it's going to go through what we successfully implemented against the specification. Okay. And then we still have some partially implemented things, which I think might be what we clean up later on when we get to that third video. AI chat, obviously this is going to be our next video because we're going to get into some pretty cool stuff with that. And then of course, anything that is completely missing, we need to make sure that this gets integrated as. So really great that we have all of this stuff. One last little bonus thing that I would recommend you guys do is to use a project management MCP. So I wanted to basically go through, use the linear MCP and start like creating tasks for me. Last thing I will say is I'm really big on the UX and the UI of things like this. I think it needs to feel a certain way. It has to feel snappy and modern and new, which I think the app that we have so far, it's kind of there. It's like halfway there, but there's a lot of stuff that we're going to still want to dial in. And so I'm going to run a similar kind of agent, but asking it specifically to analyze the UX and the UI against what our original standards were. And then once we have both of those things, we'll be able to implement them again in that third video where we're doing these detail-oriented fixes. All right, guys, well, that's it for the first video. Kind of brutal, but still pretty fun to do. And we have a pretty clear path ahead of us. So we started out, again, in phase 1. We took this really abstract idea that we had and we converted it into something very specific with our product managing agent. Then in phase 2, we took those requirements from the product manager and we built out the UX principles, the UI principles for every single feature that we have in the app and what the technical architecture needs to look like in order for that thing to come alive. We did both of those things. Then we moved into stage 3, really basic DevOps setup for local testing with Docker. And then we moved into that phase 4 piece, which took probably the most time, which was going through our user authentication, the photo uploading, all of those different features and the different nav screens that we ended up needing to have. And we just looped through that, right? We did the backend engineer, the front end engineer, the QA engineer, and the security analyst for every single one of those features, just looping, looping, looping until it was at the point that we just ended with. So the plan for the rest of these videos is that the next video, we're gonna build out that AI chat feature. So we're gonna be getting into things like vector embeddings, vector databases, retrieval augmented generation or RAG, being able to like store user conversation history, store user preferences about how they like to be communicated with, things that they like or dislike when they're trying to cook in this case. So we're going to be storing those things and then retrieving them into context when the user decides to have a chat. So that's going to be a really cool focused video on just that piece of the tool. And then again, video 3 and 4, we're going to put a lot of polish and finishing touches on things to make it feel professional and pop, handle all those weird edge cases, and then we're going to deploy it. So we're going to use Railway, we'll deploy the app, and we'll actually start using it and see what that experience is actually like. So a lot of really cool stuff, but obviously make sure you're subscribed so that you get notified when that stuff actually comes out. So yeah, that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one.